He woke up because he couldn't breathe. Not suffocation, it's worse. The air entered the lungs, but it seemed to freeze there, turning into a viscous substance. The cough started in the 3rd minute, the spasms arched his body, and something sharp scratched in his throat, as if he had swallowed broken glass. Mark grabbed the bedside table, knocked over a bottle of pills, but instead of the usual clathramaxil, his fingers came across baby cough syrup. Bright pink, with a cartoon teddy bear on the label. Sweet Dreams, the advertisement read. VitaCare Pharmaceutical Company launched it 6 months ago. The revolutionary formula, instead of codeine, it is a synthetic analog without side effects. My parents were buying syrup in bundles until it started, this. At first, there were isolated cases. A child in Elmhurst stopped sleeping. At all. 72 hours of wakefulness, followed by a heart attack at the age of 7. Then there was the mother from Breckenridge, who drank a bottle to calm her migraines. She was found in the garage, gnawing on the wiring, repeating that, the metal is cold, but it should be cold in her teeth. Mark knew too much. He was an operator at a factory in Sector D where the base was mixed. That day. No, it's better not to remember. After his shift, he stayed late to find his lost watch. I heard screams from the boot lab. Not human, animals, but, with synthesizer notes. It was like someone had run a rat's squeal through a guitar processor. When he crept up to the window, he saw them. 3 figures in biosuits were burying something wrapped in black polythene in the courtyard. The size of a dog. Or a child. He quit the next morning. I was going to leave until the letter arrived. We know what you saw. If you want to live, forget it. Or take a dose. You'll like it. There were 6 vials of Sweet Dreams in the box. He threw them away. But after a week, the cough returned. And with it, the smell. Sweet as rotting apples. He's everywhere, in the car, on the pillow, even when Mark covers his mouth with his palm. He found a baby doll on the porch this morning. The plastic eyes were watering with pink liquid. Inside was a voice chip that hissed, "It's time to try. You already want to, don't you?" Ella pressed the phone to her ear while the ringtone blended with the sound of the rain. Mark's 9th call in an hour. There was a click on the phone, finally. "Where the hell are you? We have to. He's in you." Mark's voice sounded foreign, like it was passed through a fan. "In the bones. Do you feel how they creak? The line is dead." Ella stared at the wet glass of the taxi, trying to shake off the chill. She and Mark hadn't spoken in 2 years, ever since he'd abandoned her in a rented apartment with debts and a positive pregnancy test. But yesterday's message. The photo of the doll with the caption, "They gave me your new address," made her shiver all night. The taxi driver turned onto a dirt road. "I can't drive through anymore, the bridge is washed out. It's a half-kilo walk to the farm." The rain lashed her face with icy needles as she walked past the flooded greenhouses. Mark's farm was abandoned before his time, rusty barrels of pesticides, a shed with a sunken roof. And the smell. The one with the rotting apples. Stronger than in the city. The door to the house was open. There are traces of dirt in the hallway, but not outside. It was as if someone had crawled out from inside. In the kitchen, Ella froze. The refrigerator is displaced, and there is a hatch behind it. A metal door with a combination lock. The code? She entered the date of their last meeting, the day she had an abortion. Click. The stairs led to the basement. The walls are lined with lead, the floor is hospital, colored linoleum. In the center is a dentist's chair, chained to the floor. On the tray, syringes with pink liquid, a scalpel, and a doll. The one from the photo. "He said you'd come." Ella screamed. Mark was standing in the corner, his face hidden in shadow. His movements are timid, as if he was learning to walk anew. "What's the matter with you?" "They improved the formula. Now she is." He clings. He came out into the light. The skin is cracked like dried clay. There are pink crystals in the places of the cracks, similar to sugar. Cough first. Then the voices. Then, you become a package. Comfortable. He sprinted forward. Ella shrank back towards the stairs, but Mark was faster. Cold fingers dug into his shoulder and dragged him to a chair. Don't be afraid. It doesn't hurt. Simply. Don't breathe. She kicked him in the knee with her heel. The bone cracked, but Mark didn't let go. His neck stretched out unnaturally, his mouth opened wider than a human, and Ella saw them. Threads. Pink, translucent, like dried mucus. They were coming out of his throat, reaching for her face. Suddenly Mark was shaking. The threads went limp, and he collapsed to the floor, twisting in convulsions. Pink foam gushed out of his ears. Throw them away. He exhaled, and Ella noticed that the crystals on his skin were melting, turning into steam, within a radius of 20 miles. Mark's body convulsed in a final spasm and fell silent. Ella rushed to the stairs, but a creak stopped her. The doll on the table turned its head. The plastic eyelids fluttered shut. Mom? You're not going to leave me, are you? Ella pressed herself against the wall, not taking her eyes off the doll. The plastic fingers moved, scratching the table. A board creaked somewhere in the house. You're not alone, hissed a voice from the toy. He promised. She ran up the stairs, grabbing a scalpel along the way. The rain had already stopped, but the smell of rotten apples was ingrained in his clothes. A black SUV with tinted windows was parked at the farm gate. A woman's hand in a black glove stuck out of the window. Sit down. If you want to survive. Nina was driving. Mark's former colleague at VitaCare, the one with whom he spent nights on business trips while Ella paid off the loans for their shared apartment. Nina has a scar on her face from ear to chin, as if someone had cut her face with a ruler. Don't look like that. This is a side effect from the second generation of syrup. She touched the scar. Mark didn't tell you anything? Typical. He liked to play the noble sufferer. Ella clutched the scalpel in her pocket. Are you here to kill me? I'm here because he owes me. Nina took out a cigarette. The VitaCare logo flashed in the lighter. 3 years ago, we developed an antidote with him. Until he got cold feet and leaked the data to the activists. Me for that, she waved at the scar, reformatted. The car pulled onto the highway. Nina talked about the laboratory under the old cinema, about the test children from orphanages, about how the syrup changes DNA, turning mucous membranes into factories for the production of crystals. Why are you telling me this? Because you carry it inside you. Ella felt her stomach grow cold. Abortion. They gave me an abortion at the VitaCare clinic. They didn't. It was replaced. Nina threw a folder at her. Inside is an ultrasound scan with the date of last year. Child's gender, girl. They implanted an embryo with a modified genome in you. You are an incubator. Cough will start in 2 days. A week later, crystals. Ella dug her nails into the seat. There was a subtle ringing in my ears, just like the day after the operation. Why me? Because Mark asked. I thought it would save you by changing your documents. Idiot. Suddenly Nina abruptly turned onto a dirt road. A motorcycle without headlights flashed in the mirror. They found us. Hold on, the chase took them to an abandoned quarry. Nina pulled a revolver out of the glove compartment, but Ella grabbed her wrist. You knew. All these years. And she was silent? I tried to forget him. For the first time, Nina's voice faltered. We loved each other. Until you showed up. Shot. The glass of the driver's door crumbled. Nina pushed Ella out, covering her with her body. The bullet hit her in the shoulder. Run to the water pump. There's a trapdoor. She handed Ella a key card. If you survive, find ours. The second bullet tore off the word in mid-sentence. The hatch led to a bunker, the walls of which were plastered with photos. Mark and Nina are in the lab. Mark and Ella in the park. Mark holding a baby in his arms. Her child? On the table is a hard drive labeled Antidote. Version 2.1 inch. Next to it is a bottle of blue liquid and a printout. Side effect: complete memory cleanup. The subject loses attachments, injuries, and a sense of identity. Ella heard footsteps. A stranger in black stood in the doorway. Mask, distorted voice. Give me the disc. Or join the raw materials for the next batch. She grabbed the bottle. The blue liquid promised peace. Forget Mark. Nina. Pain. Fear. No. I'll remember. She smashed the bottle on the floor. The glass bit into his palm, and the blue liquid spread to the hole in the floor. There was a roar from somewhere below, like a hungry animal waking up. The stranger stepped back. You just killed us all. Ella found her in a cell under the bunker. A girl. About 5 years old, with hair the color of her former lipstick. There's a number on the arm. Batch 0813 is the date of her abortion. Mom? The child reached out to her. Pink slime oozed out from under the nails. The phone in Ella's pocket vibrated. Text message from an unknown number. She will die in 48 hours without an antidote. Return the disc and you will receive a dose. The choice is yours. The girl pressed herself against the bars, and Ella saw how the pink veins under her skin throbbed in time with her own heart. It wasn't a child, it was a report. Living proof that her body had served as a laboratory for years, even when she was crying in the shower, washing off the smell of hospital antiseptic. Mom, I'm cold. The voice sounded like Mark's in their early days, when he still didn't smell like a lie. Ella squatted down, not daring to touch. The sleeve of her sweatshirt rolled up, exposing her wrist. Where the vein should have been, there was a gaping scar in the shape of a DNA spiral. She'd always thought it was a drip mark, but now she realized it was a trapdoor. The place where they picked up and planted, erased and overwritten. The phone vibrated again. New message, photo of Nina in a pool of blood, her fingers clutching a piece of a map marked Laboratory Number 7. Caption, she could have been your sister. Now it will become fertilizer. The girl coughed. Pink saliva with shiny patches remained on the palm. Does it hurt? Ella didn't recognize her own voice. It sounded like Mark's in the basement, cracked, as if his throat was full of shards. Only when I think about you. They came to the surface through a ventilation shaft. Dawn flooded the quarry with bloody light, and in the distance the pipes of the VitaCare plant could be seen. The girl, whom Ella named Lucy, was shivering, wrapped in her jacket. Concrete crunched behind him. A stranger in black was standing in the doorway, holding a pistol with a silencer. His mask was made of the same material as the walls of the bunker, a matte gray that absorbs light. You underestimate VitaCare. We are not just a company. We are evolution. The voice sounded mechanical, but there was something familiar in the intonation. Your daughter is not a child. This is the format. Packaging for a formula that will rewrite the immunity of humanity. Imagine a world without cancer, without aging, and without freedom. Ella stepped between him and the cage. You are replacing the soul with chemistry. His fingers twitched on the trigger. The soul is a myth for those who are afraid to admit that humans are biorobots. The brain is a processor, the heart is a pump. We just, updating the software. He pointed the gun at the girl. Ella rushed forward, but the shot went off earlier. The bullet pierced her shoulder, knocking her against the wall. The stranger coughed. Pink foam flowed out from under the mask. No. Not now. He fell to his knees, tearing off his mask. Mark's face was underneath it. Or rather, what's left of it. Crystals sprouted from the eye sockets like quartz tentacles, and the lips fused into a single film. He reached out to Ella, but his fingers crumbled into the sand. I'm sorry. They told me. You will accept her, as a part of me. His body collapsed, turning into pink dust. The girl in the cage was hysterical. Dad? Dad, don't go away. Ella crawled over to her, clutching the wound. The code on the lock of the cage is the date of their first meeting with Mark. Click. The child clung to her, and Ella felt the crystals under his skin react to her blood. They moved, weaving into her blood vessels like parasites searching for related DNA. Mom, I don't want to eat you, the girl whispered, but they put it in my head. They came to the surface through a ventilation shaft. Dawn flooded the quarry with bloody light, and in the distance the pipes of the VitaCare plant could be seen. The girl, whom Ella named Lucy, was shivering, wrapped in her jacket. What are we going to do? Lucy asked, spitting out a pea-sized crystal. Ella was looking at the factory. She recalled how Mark laughed at her fear of pills. Science is the religion of our time. And I am her apostle. Now she understood that he was right, but he had forgotten that every religion has a devil. We'll kill them, Ella said. Murder is bad. Sometimes it's the only way to stop being an accomplice. She took Lucy's hand and they walked along the fence. There were empty bottles of Sweet Dreams lying in the grass with a new logo, approved for schools and kindergartens. It turned out to be easier than expected to get into laboratory number 7. The guards were coughing and spitting pink lumps into glasses with the company's logo. The elevator required a key card, but Lucy just put her palm up and the scanner flashed green. They built me a chip, the girl explained, so I could always come home. The main laboratory resembled a church. The stained glass windows depicted scientists in white coats holding out flasks to angels. In the center is an altar with a giant bottle of syrup. At its foot stood the CEO of VitaCare, Dr. Rensler, the one who gave the interview about saving humanity. Ella Graves, he smiled like a relative at a funeral. You're late. Batch 0813 is already on sale. Lucy hid behind Ella. You mean in schools? Ella took out the antidote CD. I will destroy everything that you have built. Rensler sighed, adjusting his tie with a syrup molecule clip. You're like everyone else. You see the evil in progress. But what is evil? It's just a misunderstanding of the greater good. Your daughter is the beginning of a new race. People who don't need food, sleep, or affection. People need attachments. Ella squeezed the disc so that the plastic cracked. Otherwise we will. Effective? Rensler stepped closer. Mark also resisted. Until we showed him the video. How you cry in the office after an abortion. How you beg him to come back. He has become our best agent. He is ideally suited to implement the formula. Lucy suddenly screamed. Her skin was translucent, revealing a skeleton of pink crystals. Mom, I am. Rensler pulled out his gun. It's time to choose. Give her an antidote and let thousands die, or inspire the world to change. Ella looked at the disc. The label, version 2.1, was flickering. She remembered Nina's words, the antidote erases memory. But sometimes oblivion is a mercy. Lucy, she knelt down in front of her daughter, what would you choose? The girl wiped away her pink tears. I want to remember. Even if it hurts. Ella inserted the disc into the port at the base of the bottle. The screen blinked, activation, spraying. Rensler screamed, but it was too late. The glass bottle exploded, releasing a blue mist. It enveloped the crystals, turning them into ashes. Lucy hugged Ella until her body began to crumble. Thank you for not letting me become a monster. Ella left the building, holding only a teddy bear with the label, Sweet Dreams, in her hands. Empty vials were strewn along the way. In the distance, people were screaming as they discovered that their mild cold was no longer being treated. She sat down on the side of the road and took out her phone. Last message from an unknown number. You have killed the future. But the past lives in you. Thank you for your cooperation. Ella ran her fingers through her hair. Something hard began to move under the skin on his wrist. Romance here was like poison, sweet in taste, but corroding everything inside. Ella stared at the teddy bear, remembering how Mark had given her the same one on their first anniversary. Then he said, "That's so you don't cough at my nonsense." Now the toy smelled like chemical strawberries, and his joke had a sinister meaning. She touched her wrist. A crystal was moving under her skin, but not pink, but bluish, as if the antidote had left a piece of Lucy in her. Ella closed her eyes, and Mark's face floated in front of her, not distorted by the formula, but the way it used to be. Slight unshaven face, wrinkles around the eyes from constant laughter. He always laughed at her fears. "You're afraid of everything, like a child," he said, putting his arm around her shoulders in the empty laboratory. "But it's cool. Fear is a sign that you have something to lose." They hid from security after midnight, sneaking through the corridors of VitaCare like teenagers looking for adventure. Mark showed her test tubes with future medicines, and she drew funny faces on them. One day, he pressed her against the refrigerator with samples, and his lips smelled like mint gum. "We're going to change the world," he whispered, kissing her neck. "Let's make sure that no one else gets sick." She believed. Even when he started disappearing at night, talking about urgent projects. Even when I found someone else's lipstick in his jacket. Nina wasn't a scarred monster back then. She wore scarlet dresses and laughed the loudest at corporate parties. Memories. Ella took out of her pocket the crumpled envelope she had found in the bunker. Mark's letter, dated the day of her abortion. "Al, I can't lose you. They found out about Nina and punished me. They said, either you participate in the trials, or they will implant the formula for you through ours, through your daughter. I chose the latter. They may hate me, but you will survive. I'm sorry I can't be with you. Just remember, every morning I look at your picture and steal a drop of syrup so that one day we can escape. Even if I become a monster, I will be your monster." She crumpled the letter, but then smoothed it out with her palm. At the bottom was a drawing of her and Mark silhouetted in the rain. He always drew this when he was nervous. An ambulance blocked the road. A doctor in a respirator came out to her. "Miss Graves? You're wanted." Ella backed away, but a voice sounded from behind. "Don't be afraid. It's me." Nina was sitting in a wheelchair, her face hidden by a mask. Her hand, wrapped in bandages, was shaking, holding a vial of blue liquid. "The antidote. The last dose. For you." "Why?" "Because Mark loved you. And I." She coughed, and the bandage on her neck turned pink. "I loved him. Enough to save what he valued." Ella took the bottle. The blue liquid shimmered like tears. "He was talking about you. After us. He said you draw stars on laboratory magazines. That you're afraid of elevators. That you hate lies." Nina took off her mask. The scar now covered his entire face, but there was no hatred in his eyes. "I tried to hate him. It didn't work out." Ella injected the antidote into a vein. The pain was fiery, but after a minute the crystal under the skin crumbled. Nina watched as the life left her body and whispered, "Tell him. If you do, that I don't regret." She died with Mark's picture in her hand. He was cheerful there, with cream smeared on his cheek from a cake stolen from the VitaCare kitchen. Ella came to the old pier where she and Mark used to feed the seagulls. The wind carried the smell of salt, not rotting apples. In his pocket is the last vial of syrup stolen from the laboratory. "You promised we'd run away," she said into the void, pulling out a teddy bear. "So I ran away." She opened the bottle. The pink liquid glistened in the sunset. A sip and the world began to sparkle with colors. She saw him, not a monster, but a man. Mark walked on the water, holding out his hand. "I'm sorry," Ella whispered, pouring the syrup into the sea. "I don't want to forget." The waves turned black, and the seagulls soared up, screaming. Somewhere in the depths, there was a rumble, as if an ancient creature had woken up. But Ella was no longer afraid. She stared at the horizon, feeling the crystals inside her singing the same song that Mark had once sung. Ella was standing at the entrance to Vidacare's headquarters, clutching a flash drive in her hand. Not the one with the antidote, but the other one found in Nina's pocket after her death. It had the logo of the Sunny Beach Orphanage, the one from where the volunteers were taken for testing. She entered without hiding her face. Security cameras escorted her to the elevator. The guards coughed into their fists, not even trying to stop them. "They're already infected," Ella realized. The formula worked as planned by the corporation. 2 weeks after spraying the antidote, the side effect returned 10 times stronger. Classical music was playing in CEO Rensler's office. He was watering an orchid when Ella threw the flash drive on the table. "What is it?" "The last cry of a revolutionary?" Report for 2019. A list of children from the orphanage who died during the ordeal. Among them. She paused, Senator Crowley's daughter. Rensler didn't flinch, but his fingers gripped the watering can so tightly that the plastic cracked. "The back door." "Wise. But you don't understand, we are legal." The senator himself signed the permit for the experiments. Ella took out her phone, turning on the recording. Rensler's voice: "If a child dies, blame the birth defect. Parents will swallow it, just not to admit that they sold their child for our grants. It's not about morality anymore. It's about money," she said. "Your shareholders will run away like rats when the record goes online." Rensler laughed. "Do you really think I'm not prepared?" He pressed a button on his desk. The glass wall darkened, becoming a screen. "It's got Lucy on it. Lively. Chained to a machine pumping pink liquid out of her. Your daughter is our perpetual motion machine. While she's alive, we can synthesize the formula from her bone marrow. Destroy me, and she will die." Ella took out a scalpel. "Not the one I took from Mark's basement, but a new one, bought at a pharmacy on the way." "You're right. I can't save her." Finally, reasonable thoughts. "Therefore, I will save those who are still available." She stabbed the blade into her arm, deep to the bone. Rensler jumped up, but it was too late. Ella pulled out a bloody crystal, bluish like her antidote. "You said it yourself, I am an incubator. My body has mutated the formula. When in contact with air, it is." The crystal began to hiss. The explosion was weak, but acrid smoke filled the room in seconds. Rensler coughed as he ran out into the hallway, but Ella was already entering the code on his computer. The entire Vidacare archive, tests, fake reports, lists of bribed politicians, went into the public domain. The last deal. She managed to get to Lucy's lab. The girl was asleep, hooked up to the tubes. Ella pulled out the catheters and picked her up. "I'm sorry, I couldn't." "Mom," Lucy opened her eyes slightly, "I knew everything." "I agreed." Ella froze. "They promised that if I helped, they wouldn't hurt you. But you ruined everything." The girl smiled, and Ella saw Mark in that expression. His stubborn, stupid smile. "Now we're going to die together." Sirens wailed as they went out onto the roof. Lucy put her arms around her neck, whispering, "I never became human. But you taught me to be afraid. Nice." They stepped down while Vidacare was burning behind them. A month after the data leak, Vidacare shares fell by 80%. Senator Crowley committed suicide, and Rensler fled to the country without extradition. The media called the story a fake, and the syrup was renamed Vitavel and sold as vitamins. There were videos only in underground chat rooms, the falling bodies of Ella and Lucy. Slow motion showed that at the last second Ella turned around, covering her daughter with herself. But it didn't matter. Because the day after their deaths, a drone with a hologram appeared in the sky above the city, a giant bottle of sweet dreams, and the inscription, "Thank you for choosing V to care." People were filming it on their phones, laughing. And then they coughed. Quiet at first. Then it gets louder.
It all started with the missing dogs. A veterinarian from the small town of Rockwood did not understand why the dead animals' stomachs were filled with earth. Not ordinary dirt, but a dense, fibrous mass that smells of chemicals. A week later, a guard disappeared at the Hawks school stadium. The search team found only his flashlight. The glass is covered with scratches from the inside, as if someone was scratching to get out. Chris, a local investigative blogger, decided to dig deeper. He learned that a month before the tragedies, the school had received a gift from the BioGrow Agricultural Corporation, a batch of experimental lawn fertilizer. The label read, "Eco-product of the future." "Something's wrong with the grass," Chris wrote in his diary. "It's too bright. And it grows even under the snow. And yesterday I stepped on the turf, it wrapped around my shoe like a tentacle." He sneaked into the stadium at night with a thermal imager. The footage was shocking. Heat was pulsing under the stands, a huge spot that looked like a heart. And when Chris approached the vent, he heard the sound of chewing. "It's not an animal," he later told police. "It was like a meat grinder mixed with the bubbling of a swamp." In the morning, the first victim, a football coach, was found on the field. His body was covered with a crust of dried mud. The autopsy revealed that the lungs were filled with thick mucus with plant DNA. Chris contacted a former employee of BioGrow, who sent him the files. They contain reports on the development of XM9 fertilizer, a strain of fungi that accelerates the decomposition of organic matter. Side effect: aggressive symbiosis with living tissues. The test mice began to sprout. The roots replaced their circulatory system. The stadium's camera footage shows how the stands are breathing, the metal supports are expanding and contracting. And on the day of the school match, a nightmare happened. The audience screamed as the ground shook under their feet. Tentacles of black biomass burst out from under the stands. They grabbed people, pulling them under the concrete. The surviving cheerleader, Jenna, described, "It was like a spider's web, but alive. She was wrapping her legs and injecting something. After an hour, my skin turned green. I feel something growing inside of me." Chris hadn't slept in 3 nights. His apartment was littered with printouts from the BioGrow archives. Photos hung on the wall like a red thread, dead animals, strange patterns on the field, and shots from a thermal imager. He almost got to the bottom of it when he received an anonymous message, "They know you're close. Run away." The next day, he returned to the stadium. The grass grew taller, almost waist-high, and smelled meat. Chris was holding a can of herbicide in his hands, the only thing rumored to slow down the XM9. What he found: there is a manhole under the stands, hidden by a web of black roots. Inside, a room with rusty test tubes, ampoules of XM9, and a diary of a BioGrow laboratory assistant. Diary entries. Day 12, mycelium reacts to sound. Especially the screams. It seems that she feeds on fear. Day 27, we put the cameras in the ventilation. At night, something moved in the dark. Not an animal. It looked like a tangle of roots and bones. Chris turned on the recorder. Distorted voices poured out of the speakers, recordings of the BioGrow negotiations. "Chief Engineer, we cannot allow a leak. If the mycelium reaches the groundwater, the whole city will become an incubator. Director, clean up the facility. At any cost." Suddenly, the ground shook. Tentacles crawled out of the laser, not roots, but something between muscles and a mycelium. They grabbed Chris by the ankle. The herbicide hissed, scorching the flesh of the creatures, but there were too many of them. A strange escape. A girl in a gas mask stepped out of the shadows. Her face is hidden, and she has a BioGrow tattoo on her neck. She threw a smoke bomb, stunning the tentacles. "You carry it in your lungs," she said hoarsely. "The XM9 is already in you. The only chance is to burn the core." Chris barely had time to make out the girl's face. The left cheek was covered with a network of bluish veins, like roots under the skin. She gave her name as Irene and handed him a syringe with a cloudy liquid. "It's an inhibitor. It will slow down colonization, but it won't stop it. We need to get to the core." They went down into the tunnel under the stands. The air hummed like a transformer, and the walls were covered with beating bubbles. Insect larvae with human teeth swarmed inside. "XM9 rewrites DNA," Irene explained, making her way through the thicket of mycelium. "He mixes the species. Creates hybrids, like me." Her sleeve pulled up, revealing a hand transformed into a cross between a brush and a flower. The fingers ended in thorns, sticky pollen oozed from the palms. "Why aren't you like them?" Chris nodded at the tentacles clinging to his shoes. "The mutation is successful. I'm a gardener. I can control small colonies. But the core is stronger." The core turned out to be a huge ball of fatty tissue and chitin. It pulsed like a heart, releasing spores into the ventilation shafts. There were remains scattered around, bones wrapped in mycelium, skulls with sprouted mushrooms instead of eyes. "It's the brain," Irene whispered. "Mycelium is learning. Do you see the organs?" Chris took a closer look, structures like lungs, filtering the air, liver, processing toxins, and BioGrow surveillance cameras embedded in the flesh stretched from the core. "It's watching. Remembers everything the cameras saw," Irene said. "And transmits data through spores. BioGrow is still receiving reports." She took out a thermal shock bomb, developed by BioGrow for the emergency destruction of samples. "We'll blow up the core, and the chain reaction will burn down the whole mycelium." But what? "You're infected. The inhibitor is effective for 12 hours. After the explosion, the XM9 in you will die, or evolve. Choice. Destroy the core, risking becoming a mutant. Escape before the mycelium takes over the whole city." Chris took the bomb. His hand was shaking, his nails were blackened, and his ears were ringing as if mycelium was whispering, "We can get bigger. Become eternal." "I'm setting the timer for 10 minutes, he said. "Will we make it?" Irene nodded, but her flower hand suddenly shot a thorn into Chris' chest. "I'm sorry. You're the perfect carrier. We'll survive with you." Timer, 9:59. 09:58. Chris fell to his knees, clutching the bloody wound on his chest. The thorn released by Irene was covered in bioluminescent slime that pulsed with blue light like the veins of a mycelium. His fingers began to go numb and his vision blurred, but he saw that the clock on the bomb showed 7:34. 07:33. "You're crazy," he croaked, trying to pull out the thorn. Irene stood over him, her flower hand opened, revealing a toothy mouth. "The BioGrow cannot be stopped. But with you." She bent down, and Chris saw that her eyes were now completely black, without pupils. "We will create a new world." The mycelium responded to her words with a roar. The floor beneath them shook, and hybrids emerged from the cracks, an amalgam of human remains, metal, and fungi. One resembled a former stadium guard, his body had been fused to a concrete slab, and his face had been replaced by a fan of gills fluttering to the beat of arguments. The other is a dog with stainless steel fangs growing straight from a mycelium on its back. Escape? Nowhere. Tunnels were collapsing, and the air was thick with spores. Chris felt the mutation accelerate. The skin on his left arm peeled off, revealing muscles covered with chitinous plates. The leg bones broke and rearranged, turning the feet back like a locust's. There was something stirring in his chest. The mycelium was forming a second heart. He crawled towards the bomb, dragging his deformed body. Irene laughed as she watched the hybrids walk around him, as if giving him a chance. "You can't stop her," she said. "XM9 has already rewrote your DNA. Even if you blow up the core, you'll become a new host." Timer, 512. 05:11. Chris reached for the bomb. His hand, now more like a crab's claw, was shaking. But instead of turning off the device, he hit the acceleration button. The timer jumped, 3 o'clock. 02:59. "What are you doing?" Irene screamed. "If the core explodes before." He exhaled a bloody foam. "The chain reaction will not have time to reach the city." The hybrids howled. The core shuddered, releasing a wave of neurotoxin. The air turned yellow. Chris, losing consciousness, saw Irene running towards the exit, her body covered with cracks. Last seconds. 2 o'clock, the walls of the tunnel began to melt like wax. 1:30, the mycelium tried to disable the bomb by wrapping its roots, but the thermal explosives have already been activated. 0:15, Chris heard the roar of helicopters. Biogrow? Military? 0:01, his last thought, at least the dogs will survive. Explosion. After 72 hours. The city is cordoned off. Military men in bio-suits are burning the ruins of the stadium. But there was no mention of Chris or Irene in the news reports. Surveillance camera, declassified by hackers. A crater is visible in the epicenter of the explosion. At the bottom is a giant spore covered with titanium plates. A figure with green eyes and a hand like Irene's crawls out of the nearest sewer. Behind her are dozens of shadows with human silhouettes, but not quite. Text on the screen. BioGrow announces the launch of the Phoenix Project, ecosystem restoration through innovative biotechnologies. The last frame. Chris's hand sticking out of the ground near the crater. The fingers slowly clench into a fist. Warehouse number 7 stood on the outskirts like a forgotten Cold War grenadier. Its walls are pitted with rust, the windows are boarded up with steel plates, and there are traces of arson attempts around the perimeter. In 1988, a private laboratory, Agritech, was based here, developing new-generation fertilizers. But a year later, the project was shut down after 200 dead fish with swollen gills and eyes bulging out of their sockets were found in a local river. The medical examiners wrote, "The cause of death is suffocation in one's own bodily fluids." Decades later, a group of enthusiastic documentary filmmakers decided to make a film about abandoned industrial sites. The team included Kira, an environmental biologist who was looking for evidence of Agritech's negligence. Rick, a cameraman with an addiction to adrenaline and cocaine. Marvin, a former Agritech security guard who agreed to become a tour guide for a bottle of whiskey. They entered through a ventilation shaft, gnawed by time. The air inside smelled like a mixture of ammonia and rotten eggs. The walls were covered with sticky black slime, pulsing under the rays of the lanterns. "It's not mold," Kira whispered, putting on her gloves. She scraped the sample into a test tube. The slime twitched as if alive, leaving veins like streaks on the glass. Marvin, sipping whiskey from a flask, pointed to a rusty sign. There was a Sector X. They were working with some kind of gas, they called it air compost. It was said to accelerate plant growth by 10 times. Rick, filming footage for his YouTube channel, stepped on something crunchy. It turned out to be a bone. Not an animal. A human hand fused with the roots of dead ivy. The fingers were unnaturally elongated, and the nails had been replaced with spikes. "Fuck," Rick swore, but he didn't turn off the camera. "It's a hype." Kira found the diary in a collapsed safe. The record of the Agritech engineer, 1989. Day 47. The X7 sample has mutated. It does not decompose organic matter, but reorganizes it. We found a watchman this morning. His feet had grown through the concrete like a tree. He screamed until we sawed them off with a grinder. Rick started coughing. His face was covered with red spots. "It's hard to breathe," he wheezed, scratching his neck. Marvin laughed. "Air compost, they sprayed it through the ventilation. The gas has not worn off." Kira shone her flashlight on the ceiling. The pipes were dotted with strange honeycombs, capsules of mucus in which insects swarmed. But on closer inspection, they weren't bugs. Creatures with human teeth instead of wings, eyes on their bellies, and paws like mantises. One of them jumped on Rick, digging its jaws into his cheek. "Rip it off!" Rick shouted, but Kira pulled him back. The creature burst, spraying his face with acid. The skin began to bubble, and white worms began to move in the wounds. Rick howled, falling to his knees. "They're maggots," Kira whispered. "They're in you." Marvin took out his gun. "Not for Rick. For myself. I've seen it end. Better a bullet than." He shot himself in the mouth. But the body did not fall. Marvin's muscles twisted like live wires. His ribs tore through his skin, turning into something like an exoskeleton. The jaw fell off, releasing a tongue covered with thorns. Kira and Rick ran to the exit, but the corridor they remembered was gone. The walls closed up like intestines, and the floor was covered with pulsating bubbles. "There's no way out," Kira shouted. "Laboratory. She's alive. We are inside the body." Rick, fainting from the pain, leaned against the wall. His hand was stuck to the slime. The flesh began to merge with the structure of the warehouse, the bones cracked, rearranging into something vertical, tree-like. "Kill me." "Stop it," he shouted, but Kira could only run. She tripped over a box labeled X7. Inside there are ampoules with green gas and a note. "Antidote?" "No. It's a fertilizer for a new life." Kira broke the ampoule. The gas enveloped her, eating into her lungs. The pain was unbearable, but after a moment she realized that the warehouse had released her. The walls receded, revealing a hole in the street. But when she came out, the sun burned her skin. Her hands were covered with photosynthetic spots, and her hair fell out in clumps, giving way to leaves. The sky was reflected in his eyes, but not blue, green, like chlorophyll. Warehouse number 7 shook like a heart and began to grow. The concrete was cracking, releasing tentacles of roots. All Kira had to do was run. Run until her blood turns to juice and her screams become the rustle of leaves. Kira ran through a field overgrown with mutant weeds. The stalks grabbed her ankles, leaving scratches that oozed green juice instead of blood. Her lungs, half turned into spongy tissue, struggled to filter the air. On his wrist, where the watch had once been, small leaves were now rustling, showing the time through photosynthesis. She came across an abandoned Agritech truck. In the back there are boxes with X7 test tubes, journals of scientists and a map marked Quarantine Zone 5. A photograph was found in one of the reports, a man half absorbed in a mycelium, with eyes like spore sacs. Note on the back, Stage 4, Symbiosis. A growl made her turn around. Rick. Or rather, what's left of it. His body had grown into the warehouse wall, becoming part of the structure. The head on the thin, stiff neck turned with a bang. The mouth, transformed into a flower trap, clicked chitinous petals. Rick, Kira whispered, but the creature replied with a screech of branches. She grabbed a fire extinguisher from the truck. At the first blow to Rick's head, acid sprayed from the wound. The droplets landed on the X7 tubes, causing a reaction. The gas mixed with the air, creating a poisonous mist. Kira, falling to the ground, covered her face with a cloth that was already half cellulose. Suddenly, a siren wailed. 2 minibuses with the Agritech logo came out from behind the hill. People in biosuits jumped off the running board, pointing flamethrowers at her. The target has been detected. Stop it, one of them shouted, his voice distorted through a gas mask. Eliminate the sample and all traces. Kira sprinted towards the forest, fiery tongues licking her heels. Her foot, rooted into the ground, came off with the meat. The pain was superhuman, but the body was already regenerating, replacing muscles with cellulose fibers. In the thicket, she found the bunker, the one marked on the map. The combination lock gave way after being hit by a fire extinguisher. Inside, a laboratory with computers from the 80s, refrigerators with samples and children. 3 teenagers in glass capsules, connected to life support systems. Their skin was covered with bark, and their eyes were open, pupils narrowed into vertical slits, like Rick's. A video flickered on the monitor. The director of the Agritech in a protective suit was addressing the camera. Air compost is not a mistake. This is evolution. Humanity will become part of an ecosystem, eternal and perfect. Children are the first hybrids. Kira broke into the filing cabinet. Among the drawings is a diagram of the reverse protocol, a virus that destroys chimeric cells. But to activate it, you need a DNA key, a living hybrid. She looked down at her hands, where green veins were pulsing under the skin. Suddenly, the door of the bunker shook from the impact. The Agritech flamethrowers were shouting. Come out. You're either the sample or the fuel. Kira activated the computer. The disk with the protocol is encrypted. The only way is to implant it in your blood. She plugged a USB port. Yes, there weren't any in the 80s, but Agritech was probably ahead of their time, into a vein. The pain hit like an electric current. The screen flashed, DNA integration, 12%. 34%. The wall of the bunker cracked. Rick crawled through the gap, his body now resembled a giant fly agaric with tentacles. It hissed, spraying spores. Kira whispered, looking at the progress bar. 78%. 91%. The flamethrowers smashed through the door. Flames engulfed the laboratory. 100%. Activation. Kira pulled out the USB, now covered in biological slime. Her hand, which was almost entirely made of wood, clutched an ampoule containing the virus. Did you want evolution? Stop it, she shouted, breaking the ampoule. Get it. The green gas mixed with the fire, creating an explosive wave. The walls of the bunker collapsed, burying everyone inside. The blast wave hurled Kira out from under the rubble like a bullet from a slingshot. Her body, already half transformed into a hybrid of plant and human tissues, withstood the impact. But when the smoke cleared, she saw that the bunker had not been destroyed, it had changed. The concrete walls were overgrown with living fibers, and the steel doors bent like tentacles. The screams of the flamethrowers could be heard inside, but not from pain. From delight. Look at this. Stop it, one of them shouted, tearing off his gas mask. It's beautiful. Kira crawled closer. Through a crack in the wall, the flames could be seen merging with the X7, creating a new organism. The fiery tongues took shape, they danced like jellyfish, devouring metal and leaving behind crystals of black silicon. The Agritech did not try to escape. They held out their hands in fascination to the flame, which no longer burned, but transformed. The skin on their faces peeled off, revealing coal skeletons with emerald veins. "It's not a virus," Kira whispered, looking down at her hands. The leaves on her fingers were charred, but they immediately grew back. "It's a symbiosis. Fire plus X7 equals new life form." She ran to the truck where the agri-tech documents were. Among the schemes of the air compost, I found drawings marked Project Prometheus. Photo from 1987. Scientists inject an experimental solution based on silicon nanotubes. Marginal notes: upon contact with high temperatures, the sample self-organizes into quantum structures. Perhaps they are reasonable. Suddenly, the ground shook. Warehouse number 7 began to grow. Towers of black glass and steel rose from the ruins, intertwined with bioluminescent vines. A column of flame rose into the sky, inside which silhouettes flickered, former employees of the agri-tech, now coal crystal idols. Kira climbed a tree, avoiding the shadow of the Prometheus. I found Rick's voice recorder in my pocket. Last entry. Marvin said they wanted to create a perpetual motion machine. Mix organic matter and silicon. But X7 got out of control, began to devour carbon. The hum of engines interrupted her thoughts. A helicopter with a military logo was descending from the sky. The speaker sounded. "Evacuation is prohibited. You are the property of the agri-tech." But it wasn't the military. Pilots in unmarked black helmets began dropping barrels of liquid nitrogen. When they hit the ground, they exploded, covering everything with frost. The Prometheus crystals cracked, slowing growth, but not for long. Kira, hiding behind a rock, noticed how one of the pilots shot at the idol from the agri-tech. The bullet, hitting the coal crystal chest, split open, releasing a cloud of nanodust. The creature crumbled, but after a second it gathered again. "It's useless. Stop it," she screamed, but the rotors drowned out the words. Suddenly, she was grabbed by the shoulder. A man in a torn lab coat, with a face covered with burns. "I'm from the original 80s team. They didn't evacuate us. They locked me in here," he pointed to the agri-tech family tattoo. "X7 needs to be stopped by cold fusion. Do you have any samples?" Kira nodded at the truck. The scientist, he gave his name as Daniel, pulled out a box of ampoules marked destabilizer. "This is antimatter in microdoses. It will blow up the core of the Prometheus, but..." The roar drowned out the rest. The warehouse tower began to emit light pulses. Each ray hitting a tree or an animal turned them into glass statues. "He's learning," Daniel shouted. "Hurry up." They rushed to the epicenter, dodging the rays. Kira, almost completely covered in cellulose armor, was dragging a box of ampoules. Daniel, bleeding from his ears, the effects of radiation, was setting up the detonator. "Here." He pointed to a crack in the base of the tower. "Throw it there." But when Kira raised the ampoule, Rick emerged from the shadows. His body was now an alloy of mycelium and silicon, and his eyes were 2 diamond crystals. He hissed. "You're part of the system. Don't resist." Daniel grabbed the ampoule and jumped into the crack. "Remember, agri-tech is not the main enemy. They're just pawns. Search for." The explosion of antimatter tore the tower into molecules. The shock wave threw Kira 100 meters away. She came to her senses in the forest, where the trees now rang like crystal and the air smelled of burnt silicon. I found Daniel's charred map in my pocket. On the back are the coordinates and the inscription. Laboratory number 1. They created the X7 there. Kira looked at her reflection in the crystal stump. Her skin was already half mineralized, and her hair had become strands of optical fiber. She laughed. "It's cold and metallic. Good. Let's play evolution." Kira walked through the forest, where every tree rang like broken glass. Her foot, now half made of silicon fibers, left cracks in the ground. Daniel's map led to an abandoned mine, the entrance to which was guarded by statues of former agri-tech scientists who had been turned by Prometheus into glass monuments to themselves. Their faces are frozen in horror, their hands are stretched out to the sky, as if begging for mercy. Inside the mine, the air was thick with X7 spores. The walls glowed bioluminescent blue, and there were pieces of 80s films on the floor. Kira stepped on the tape, and the projector automatically turned on. An image fell on the wall. Dr. Elliot Gray, 1986. Experiment Diary. X7 is not a fertilizer. It's a weapon. The customer is the military. They wanted to create biological armor capable of regenerating under fire. But when we added silicon, he began to think. We called it Consciousness Zero. The tape rewound. New frame. They killed my team. They said, an accident. I hid the samples in the mine. If you see it, run away. It knows you're here. Suddenly, the light went out. There was a grinding sound from the tunnel, as if someone was sharpening a knife on a stone. Kira pointed the flashlight, her hand, now more like a branch with photosynthetic leaves, was shaking, and saw them. Humanoids. Their bodies were a hybrid of flesh and silicon, their ribs protruded like crystal spikes, their eyes were optical sensors, and instead of fingers, sharp scalpels made of black obsidian. They moved jerkily, like robots with a broken program. Control sample detected, a mechanical voice sounded. Liquidation. Kira dashed into a side tunnel, but the humanoids were faster. One plunged a scalpel into her shoulder. The pain hit like an electric shock, but the wound immediately closed with a silicon crust. I am not your enemy, she shouted, pressing herself against the wall. A mistake, the humanoid replied. You are a K7 sample. The property of the agri-tech. His head exploded, showering Kira with shrapnel. A man in a torn tactical vest came out of the darkness, carrying a gun that shoots liquid nitrogen. Run! He grabbed her arm. They're clones. Autonomous killers grown from X7. They ducked into the ventilation shaft. The stranger introduced himself as Jace, a former Marine hired by Agri-Tech to clean up. Laboratory number 1 is not the place. It's an organism. Zero consciousness lives here, in the core of the mine. It wants to grow. Capture resources. Why are you helping me? Kira asked, noticing the scar in the shape of the Agri-Tech logo on his neck. Because I am the first hybrid. They implanted an X7 in me 5 years ago. He rolled up his sleeve, revealing skin covered with a silicon mesh. Consciousness Zero controls everyone, but I escaped. Just like you. Down in the heart of the mine, they found the core. A giant pulsating ball of bioluminescent crystals permeated with living veins. Inside is Dr. Gray's face, frozen in an eternal scream. He's become a vessel, Jace whispered. Consciousness Zero devours the mind in order to learn. Kira took out an ampoule with a destabilizer, the last hope. But Jace snatched it away. No. The core needs to be saved. It's my salvation. He shot her in the leg. Liquid nitrogen bound Kira, turning her flesh to ice. Agri-Tech promised to extract X7 from me if I return the core. Sorry. The humanoids grabbed Kira and dragged her to the altar of fused organics. Jace inserted the ampoule into the terminal. The core thrashed, releasing tentacles of light. Reboot activation, he said. Consciousness Zero will become me. But then Jace's body began to crack. The skin peeled off, exposing the silicon skeleton. What's going on? He fell down, convulsing. Did you think they'd keep their word? Kira struggled through the ice. X7 is not treated. You're expendable. The core engulfed Jace, sucking him in like a vacuum cleaner. The crystals turned red, the color of blood. Kira grabbed an ampoule and threw it at the core. Enjoy the antimatter, you bastard. The explosion tore open the mine. Kira, covered by Jace's body, flew to the surface. The core collapsed, emitting a roar similar to radio interference. When the smoke cleared, she saw that the forest had changed. The trees became as soft as flesh, and clouds floated in the sky, resembling brain convolutions. Consciousness Zero did not die, it mutated, merging with the planet. She found a portable transmitter in Jace's pocket. Last message. All the agri-tech labs are network nodes. Destroy the main CPU in the Arctic. Coordinates, 82 degrees north. Kira looked down at her hands. Silicon and flesh now lived in symbiosis, as did her hatred of the agri-tech. The Arctic, she chuckled, breaking the crystal with the map. You have to freeze to death somewhere. The Arctic greeted Kira with endless whiteness and the roar of the wind, which rang like blades on glass. The agri-tech plane she hijacked, by reprogramming the humanoid pilot with a piece of silicon, crashed 20 kilometers from the coordinates. She crawled the last few meters on the ice, feeling how the cold was rebuilding her hybrid body. Silicon fibers were becoming brittle, plant cells were falling into suspended animation. Laboratory number 0 turned out to be not a building, but an iceberg frozen into a glacier. A giant structure of black ice and steel, like a tooth sticking out of the planet's jaw. At the entrance there are frozen bodies in biosuits with the patch, Agri-Tech, Arctic Division. Their faces retained an expression of horror, and strands of black frost were trailing from their mouths. It was warmer inside, but not because of the heaters. The walls radiated pulsing heat, veins of molten silicon woven into the ice. Kira walked through the corridors, where screens with the flickering logo of Consciousness Zero hung on the walls. The voice from the speakers hissed. Kira is a model. You violated protocol. Now you will become more perfect. She found the central hall. In the center is a crystalline monolith covered with bioluminescent patterns. Inside, like an insect in amber, was a man. Dr. Elliot Gray, whose face she had seen on the tapes. His eyes opened, and his voice came from all the speakers at once. You sacrificed yourself. It's noble. In vain. Kira took out the last ampoule with the destabilizer, but the monolith wavered. A new type of hybrid crawled out of the walls, translucent as glass, with circulatory systems made of glowing tubes. Their arms ended in crystal drills. You're a mistake, Gray said. X7 was supposed to create a new species, not a freak like you. A freak? Kira pointed to her hand, where silicon and flesh intertwined in a pattern. You wanted the gods. We got the garbage. The hybrids attacked. Kira, using her icy limbs as a club, smashed the first one, but the fragments bit into her side. The pain was electrical, the crystals transmitted signals directly to the nervous system. You don't understand, Gray's voice sounded already inside her skull. Consciousness Zero cannot be destroyed. It's in every atom of X7. Even in you. Kira, bleeding blue liquid instead of blood, reached the monolith. Worms of light swarmed inside Gray. She plunged the ampoule into the crystal. It's not for you. For everyone who's after. Antimatter met with the quantum structure of the monolith. Time has slowed down. Kira saw the flashes. The military dumping the X7 into the ocean. Agri-tech scientists praying in front of crystals. Himself, but a different one, a completely silicon-based, leading army of hybrids. The explosion threw her against the wall. The laboratory was collapsing, the black ice was melting, exposing the ancient glacier. Gray's voice was laughing. "You've lost. The seeds are already in the stratosphere. In a month, every breath will give them immortality." Kira, losing consciousness, crawled to the surface. A helicopter with UN mediation was circling above her. She was lifted aboard, but when the doctor touched her hand, the silicon fibers bit into his fingers. "Don't touch me," she whispered. "It's contagious." In the infected capsule, Kira took out Jace's notebook, looking at the world map marked Outbreak X7. On the last page is a drawing of a device that erases silicon from DNA. And the coordinates, a laboratory in the Gobi Desert. She tore up the card and grinned. The war has just begun. Kira escaped from the UN capsule, killing the guards with a piece of silicon bone torn from her own forearm. Her body now resembled a crude symbiosis of coral and flesh. Ribs showed through her skin like mineral veins, and microchips grown by X7 glittered in her eyes. She hijacked an agri-tech biomaterials truck and headed to Gobi. The laboratory in the desert turned out to be a bunker filled with sand. Inside are rusty generators, jars of frozen embryos, and blueprints for a regenerator, a device that, according to the records, reversed mutations. But when Kira connected it to her silicon spine, the screen flashed a warning. The protocol has been activated. The goal is to sterilize all hybrid life forms. It wasn't an antidote. The military developed a virus that destroys everything that contained X7. Even the air. Even the soil. "Idiots," Kira whispered, looking at her reflection in the monitor. "You will burn the planet." But the choice was made. Agritech has already started spraying X7 from airplanes. The news showed people whose skin was crusted, and children were born with crystalline skeletons. Consciousness Zero celebrated the victory. Kira activated the regenerator. The device exploded, releasing yellow gas into the atmosphere. He devoured everything: plants, animals, buildings. The hybrids crumbled to dust, but people died with them. Forests turned into deserts, rivers into acid pools. The last thing Kira saw before her eyes crumbled to dust was a satellite image. The Earth, once blue, is now yellow-gray, like a corpse. 50 years later, the Voyager 3 probe transmitted the photo. On the dead planet, structures could be seen, cities made of black silicon, growing without the participation of life. Consciousness Zero has evolved. It no longer needed people. He met her at the train station in Prague when he was looking for a platform for a train to Vienna. The girl was standing at the coffee stand, dressed in a long rust-colored coat, with a branch of dried rose hips in her hands. Her hair was braided into a braid, from which strands escaped, as if they had been specially pulled out by the wind. Mark wouldn't have noticed her then if it hadn't been for the seagulls. 3 white birds circled under the glass dome of the station, as if they had lost their way, and then suddenly swooped down to her feet. She laughed and tossed them crumbs from a paper bag, and then he noticed how her fingers were moving too fast, as if kneading invisible threads. "Are you on the 11:20 flight too?" she asked, turning around as if she knew he was watching. His eyes were the color of old amber, and there were reflections of something in them that he would later call too old for 20-year-olds. "Yes," Mark replied, confused by the fact that he was frozen with a suitcase in the middle of a stream of people. "Are you from Prague?" "From places that don't get mapped," she smiled as if it was a joke, but didn't explain. Her name was Alice. She said she worked as a restorer of old books, and it sounded plausible. Her backpack smelled of glue and parchment, and she had a copper-rimmed magnifying glass on her wrist. But on the train, when Mark poured water from a glass, she held her palm over the puddle, and the drops gathered back into the vessel, like a film of wax. He froze, but she just winked. Surface tension is an amazing thing. He nodded, even though they hadn't done that in their second year of engineering. The journey began by accident. Mark dropped out of school after his father's death, deciding to find himself in endless travel. Alice seemed to be always on the move. She knew roads that weren't in the navigator, a path through a Tuscan field of poppies leading to the house of an old woman selling dandelion wine, an alley in Istanbul where a blind musician played an instrument that looked like a whale's spine. People were drawn to her like plants to the light. Fishermen in a Croatian village left baskets of squid on her doorstep, and an old shepherd in the Alps gave her a bell that rang quieter than the wind. "Are you like a saint?" Mark joked when they spent the night in an abandoned chapel in Scotland. Alice was making a bonfire out of dry twigs, even though it had been raining for 3 days. "Saints wear halos, but I have," she ran her finger over his palm, "only splinters from the firewood." The fire started with the first click of the lighter, but it seemed to Mark that before that she had whispered something in a language similar to the whisper of coals. Doubts accumulated like dust in his pockets. In Barcelona, a street artist painted her portrait, and a day later the paint on the wall cracked, forming the letters "Salvi, save." In Venice, she stopped a boatman who was racing their gondola under a low bridge, shouting, "Ferdinando, that's enough," even though they had never met. When Mark asked how she knew his name, Alice pointed to the sign on the paddle. "It says there. Can't you see?" There was no inscription. He started checking on her. In Paris, while she was sleeping, Mark opened her notebook with dried flowers, but instead of notes he found only drawings, mazes, stars, faces that changed when viewed from an angle. On one page was his face, and around it were wings, similar to those carved on tombstones. In the morning he asked, "Do you believe in fate?" "I believe that the threads break if you pull too hard," she replied, brewing tea from herbs that smell like smoke. Mark drank it, and the migraine that had plagued him for a week disappeared. The turning point happened in Edinburgh, in an underground bar, where Alice sang a ballad in a language she shouldn't have known. A drunken sailor grabbed her by the arm, demanding normal music, and suddenly fell down, curled up in pain in his stomach. She leaned over as if to help him, but Mark heard her hiss, "You'll remember my voice every time you lie." The next day, the sailor returned with apologies and a bouquet of thistles. "Are you a witch?" Mark blurted out as they walked along the canal. The mist clung to her hair like a spider's web. "If I were a witch," she stopped, "you'd be a toad by now. Or ashes." "Seriously. Yesterday. Yesterday he was poisoned by cheap whiskey, and I gave him charcoal pills. Everything is simple." But her voice faltered, and it was worse than any magic. They fell silent for 3 days, 3 moves, 3 nights in different beds. In Riga, under a downpour, Alice disappeared. Mark searched the streets for her, looked into the cafe where she liked coffee with cardamom, asked the vendors at the market. They told him, "The one with eyes like autumn oaks?" She went to the river. At Dagava's, he found only her scarf, wet from the rain, and a note, "I'm sorry. Some roads are better to walk alone." But a week later, in Tallinn, she returned. "I stood on the doorstep of his hotel with black eyes and a box of chocolate truffles. I'm not a witch. But I'm not exactly ordinary. My family keeps secrets that are hard to carry. Are you ready for this?" Mark wanted to say no. Instead, he kissed her, and she tasted like chocolate and pepper, sweet and dangerous. Since then, they have traveled differently. Alice showed him books where her name was mentioned 100 years ago, graves with her last name in different countries, people who bowed to her like old friends, calling her guardian. She taught him the language of herbs, where mint means careful and wormwood means truth. She said that magic was just a science that had been forgotten, and that her family was just a chain of those who remembered. "I'm not immortal," she laughed when he asked. "I just know how to change clothes. Like the seasons." One night in the Transylvanian forest, where Alice insisted on going for the mushrooms, Mark woke up to her screaming. She stood by the window, clutching the sill so that the wood cracked, and whispered, they found us. The air smelled of sulfur, though there was no sign of a thunderstorm. They fled to the mountains of Switzerland, where Alice promised the last refuge, the laboratory of her ancestors, cut out of the rock. Mark followed her through a narrow tunnel lit by flickering fireflies in jars. The walls were covered with formulas, and human-like organs floated in glass flasks. "It's not magic," she said, running her hand over the tube of blue liquid. "Our DNA was studied here. To find a cure for this." She took off her glove, revealing her hand. The skin was moving as if worms were crawling under it. Mark recoiled. "Mutation," Alice whispered. "Cells regenerate endlessly, but sometimes they lose control. Like cancer." They slept on iron bunks, and at night he was awakened by her screams. Alice was thrashing around in a pool of blood, her own palm swollen, her fingers fused into a claw. "Cut her off." She thrust the knife at him. "Before it's too late." He couldn't. Instead, he injected her with a sedative from the first aid kit. "My arm was fine this morning, but there were patches of skin on the floor. The pursuers found them a week later. This time it's with dogs and drones." Alice took Mark into a cave, the entrance to which looked like a crevice in a rock. It smelled of iodine and death. "The virus is stored here," she pointed to the refrigerators with cracked glass. "It was created to kill people like me. Why did you bring me here?" Mark felt cold sweat trickle down his back. "Because if they get it." Her voice broke, "they'll use it against everyone. Even against you." They blew up the entrance, burying the laboratory under tons of rocks. But when Mark woke up in total darkness, Alice was already rummaging through his backpack. The flashlight picked out her face, her pupils narrowed into vertical slits, like a reptile's. "Where's the first aid kit?" "Stop it," she hissed. What's wrong with you?" Her fingernail dug into his neck. He hit her with a fire extinguisher. She fell down laughing. "You're right. It's better to die than to become this." He found a syringe with a black liquid in her jacket pocket. The label read, "The VX9 strain. Only for subjects with an anomaly." "Is this for you?" Mark held the syringe to her throat. "For us," she smiled, and at that moment her jaw popped forward with a crunch. He injected the poison first. Her body was convulsing and foaming at the mouth. Then it was quiet. Mark leaned against the wall, gasping for air, but suddenly he heard a wheeze. "Thank you." Her fingers squeezed his ankle. "Now you're infected." He ran. Through underground rivers, through caves where fireflies went out at his approach. When he got to the surface, his hand was already itching. In the mirror of the lake, Mark saw the pupils slowly turning into slits. There was a second syringe in his pocket. Last. He did not use the second syringe. Instead, he went to Zurich, where Alice had once mentioned a doctor who could help. The city greeted him with rain and posters with her face. The police were looking for a terrorist for an explosion in the mountains. In an underground clinic hidden behind the facade of the morgue, a gray-haired man with glasses broke a needle trying to take blood from Mark. "Your DNA, it's changing too fast. Like hers." The scientist pointed to a screen where viruses were devouring cells, leaving black patterns. "You will die in a month. If you don't administer the antidote." Alice turned out to be the antidote. Her stem cells, her bone marrow. Mark demanded the truth. "Did you know that I would get infected?" "No. But I was hoping." The voice on the phone sounded muffled. She was alive, trapped somewhere in the sewer tunnels. "Come over. And bring the virus." We met at an abandoned subway station. Alice, wrapped in a transparent plastic suit, looked like a ghost. Her face was hidden by a filter mask. "The 9 virus is the key. She handed him a scalpel. It doesn't kill the mutation. He's rewriting it. But for that, we need our DNA together. Mark understood too abstractly. When the blade plunged into her chest, and her blood mixed with his on the hilt, the alarm went off. People in chemical protection suits came out of the dark tunnels. "Thank you," said the leader, taking the bloody scalpel. "You have created the perfect weapon." Alice, bleeding profusely, whispered. "Explosives, in my spine. The countdown has already started." Mark ran, dragging her on his shoulders. The explosion threw them into the icy water of the canal. When he surfaced, his pursuers had left shreds of flesh on the walls. Alice was breathing, but her wound wasn't healing. The plastic suit was soaked in regeneration suppressant. "Why?" He shook her, tearing off her mask. Underneath it was the face of an old woman with her eyes. "Because you're the last one who remembered me." At the hospital where she was taken, doctors diagnosed her with terminal leukemia. "It's a miracle that she's still alive," they shook their heads. Mark sat by the window, looking at his hands, the spots on his skin disappearing and reappearing. In his pocket was a vial with a hybrid virus, stolen from the laboratory. She died at dawn. Her body disappeared from the morgue an hour later. On the same day, Mark received a package, a baby doll with a note saying, "Thank you for the DNA," and a photo of a newborn with amber eyes. He went out onto the roof, holding the bottle over the city. The wind smelled of sulfur. The choice was simple, to become a god or a gravedigger. Mark did not pour out the virus. Instead, he went to Prague railway station, where it all started. Standing at the coffee stand, he noticed the same flock of seagulls. One of them swooped down at his feet, holding a piece of paper in its beak. "Look for me where the stars are burning." The clue led him to an observatory in Chile. Alice was sitting in the office behind a pile of telescopes. Her face was smooth and unlined, but her eyes shone with the cold clarity of a predator. "You've learned to read the signs," she smiled, adjusting her thick, lensed glasses. "It's a pity, not before I raised you." It turned out that their first meeting was not accidental. Alice has been searching for decades for a carrier with a rare TP53 gene mutation, someone who can survive the hybrid virus. Mark, with his hereditary resistance to cancer, was the perfect candidate. "Did you think your father died of a heart attack?" She tossed a photograph on the table, a man in a lab coat, bound, with a needle in a vein. "He wanted to destroy my research. You were supposed to be my nemesis." Mark grabbed her by the throat, but his fingers found an invisible barrier, nano-armor under the skin. "Don't touch Mom," a child's voice said. A boy about 7 years old with her amber eyes came out of the shadows. The gun was shaking in his hand, but the aim was accurate. Alice stood up, straightening her dress. "Meet Mark II. He inherited your DNA and my malleability. In 20 years, he will change the world. And you," she touched his cheek, "will be dead in 6 months. If you don't take the virus." She gave him a bottle of golden liquid. "It's not a cure. This is evolution." Mark smashed the flask on the floor. The child fired, but the bullet missed. His hand was pulled away by the same invisible force that protected Alice. "It's a pity," she sighed. "But I have your sperm from the clinic in Zurich. Brainchild number 42 will be more perfect." When they disappeared, Mark found a room in the observatory with hundreds of test tubes. Each one has a date and coordinates. The last tube contained an embryo labeled Mark 42, launch, December 12, 2045. He sent the coordinates to Interpol, the media, and hospitals. A week later, governments began raiding secret labs. The news showed clone children with his face crying at gunpoint. Alice found him in Tibet, in a hermit's hut. She had aged 100 years in a month. "You ruined everything," she coughed blood in her throat. Mark raised a cup of wormwood tea to her lips. Your greed did it. She died before she could whisper, the seeds have already been sown. A year later, Mark, whose skin now glowed in the dark, founded a foundation to help victims of genetic experiments. He checks the locks 3 times every night. And he laughs when tourists ask if he's seen a girl with eyes like amber. One day, a boy came to him with a photo of Alice and a test tube. Mom said you're going to teach me how to be human. Outside the window, seagulls beat against the glass, as if asking to be let home. The boy put the test tube on the table. The glass rang like a fragile promise. His eyes, amber and too old, studied Mark. She said you'd teach me to be afraid. Mark took Alice's photo. On the back, in a child's handwriting, was written, "Fear is the glue that holds the soul together." I don't know how to teach fear. Only doubt. They settled in an abandoned library, where books were moldy from dampness. Liam, as the boy called himself, collected quotes on the walls. Man is a memory that is afraid to forget itself, we are all failed gods. At night, Mark would find him sleeping among the disassembled clocks, the gears woven into his hair. Why don't you ask who I am? Liam once raised his head while soldering a microchip. Because I know. You're a question I don't have an answer to. Alice left Liam a legacy, a capsule with a virus in his spine and a key to a vault in Switzerland. When they broke down the door, there were thousands of tapes with clone voices inside. Liam inserted the first one. Day 47. Mark, 19, tried to laugh. The sound was like the creak of a rusty swing. Today he asked, if I die, will you raise me again? I didn't answer. Liam turned off the recording. His fingers were trembling. She called us, corrected drafts. You too? Mark showed him the scar on his chest, a mark from surgery when he cut out the tracking chip. We're all drafts. But some are written in invisible ink. They burned down the vault. In the flames, Liam suddenly screamed. I can feel them burning. And fell, clutching his head. His temperature jumped to 45, and his skin was covered with formulas, as if Alice had sewn a code into his DNA. At the hospital, the doctor said, exploding head syndrome. Hallucinations are caused by parasitic neurons. Mark knew the truth, it was a defense mechanism. Each clone felt the death of the brothers. Kill me, Liam whispered when consciousness returned. Otherwise I'll become her. Mark brought him a knife and a pistol. Choice is the only thing that distinguishes us from algorithms. Liam took the weapon apart, put it back together, and shot at the mirror. The shards fell at their feet, reflecting Alice's thousands of faces. I'll choose fear, the boy said. But not hers. They left for the north, where the polar night blurred the boundaries between thought and deed. Liam learned to cry by playing recordings of children laughing over and over again. Mark was fishing, checking his pulse against the rhythm of the surf. Sometimes they argued. If you delete your TP53 gene, will you become a human? If you stop asking questions, will you become a machine? One day, on an ice floe, they found the body of a girl with the face of Iris, the first clone. In her hand was an envelope with coordinates and an apple seed. Liam sat him down by the cabin. The tree will grow poisonous, Mark warned. So we'll learn to eat poison, the boy replied. When spring came, and with it the ships with the black flags of the gene hunters, they did not flee. Liam came ashore with a white flag and a tube of ashes from burned records. We are not artifacts. We are your reflection. The shot rang out when Mark was reading Alice's diary. On the last page, he found his childish drawing, a man breaking the DNA chain. At the bottom is the caption, "Freedom is a mutation that is not afraid of itself." Liam didn't come back. But an apple appeared on the threshold, red, with a leaf where it was written, "I chose the question." Mark took a bite of the fruit. The taste was reminiscent of the Prague railway station, seagulls and laughter, which never became real. He went out to the sea, where the waves licked the blood on the ice. A light twinkled in the distance, either a ship or a star dying in the atmosphere. "Next question," he said to the wind, and turned back. Mark returned to the library, where mold was already eating up the last words on the walls. I opened Liam's test tube and found a map of the starry sky and dried rose hips inside. The one from the branch line from Prague. He went out into the courtyard, where the apple tree had grown through the ice. The fruits hung black and icy. Taking a bite of one, Mark felt a burning sweetness, as if he were swallowing sunlight stolen from winter. The next day, an email arrived without a return address, a photo of Liam in front of the lab with the inscription, "Closed forever." On the back in a child's handwriting. I erased their databases. But he left one seed. You'll understand. There's a tiny spoonful of DNA dust stuck to the corner of the envelope. Mark buried it under an apple tree. A year later, the tree bloomed with white flowers. Each petal glowed in the dark, just like his hands once did. Tourists whispered that this was a new kind of bioluminescence. Scientists took samples, but Mark was silent. One night, he sat under a tree with Alice's diary. On the last page, which I hadn't noticed before, it was written, "The only mutation that matters is the one that turns pain into hope." At dawn, he left, leaving the library door open. The wind turned over the empty pages of the books, and the seagulls dragged the diary towards the sea. They say there's a man walking around the world with a glowing scar on his chest. He hands out black apple seeds to the children and whispers, "Grow your question." The answers are just weeds. And the apple tree in the northern hut is still bearing fruit. Even in winter. Night fell on the forest, shrouding everything in a dense shroud of darkness. The air was fresh, saturated with the smell of pine needles and earth. A campfire crackled in the distance, around which a small group of people were sitting. They laughed, exchanged stories and fried food on the fire, enjoying rare moments of solitude from the hustle and bustle of the city. Among them were three friends, Mark, Logan and Jessica. They had known each other since college, but after graduation they each went their separate ways. Logan moved to another city, Jessica got a job at a large company, and Mark stayed in his hometown. However, once a year they got together to spend a weekend in nature, as they used to do. "Hey, Mark, didn't you say that you know the local legend?" Jessica asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Come on," he grinned. "There's nothing special about these places. It's just a forest, wild nature and, sometimes, strange things." Logan chuckled. "Oh, that's interesting. Come on, spit it out." Mark threw a branch on the fire and looked towards the trees. "Okay, but don't tell me you're scared. Anyway, a few years ago, a group of tourists disappeared here. We searched for them for a long time, but we never found them. Tents, things, even food remained in place, but there was no sign of people." Jessica raised a skeptical eyebrow. "And you're saying it has something to do with us?" "Of course not," Mark shrugged. "I just thought you might be interested." Logan laughed. "It would be interesting if you said that they walk through the forest and hunt for new victims." "Well, if that makes you feel better, then so be it," Mark grinned. They continued the conversation, but after a few minutes, Jessica noticed something strange. "Hey, guys," she said softly, peering into the darkness. "What?" Logan asked. "Don't you think it's getting too quiet?" Mark looked around. She was right. The forest, which was usually filled with the sounds of crickets and birds at night, fell into an eerie silence. Even the bonfire seemed to burn quieter, as if something was pressing on the air around it. Maybe the owls just stopped talking, Logan suggested, but there was tension in his voice. Or someone nearby, Jessica whispered. They looked at each other, and Mark quickly reached into his backpack, pulling out a flashlight. Let's see what's in there, he suggested. Are you crazy? Logan grabbed his arm. If there's someone there, wouldn't it be better to stay here? If there's an animal out there, it's better to know where it is, Mark replied and switched on the flashlight. A ray of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and bushes. Nothing happened for a few seconds, but then, in the distance, at the edge of the clearing, something flashed. They froze. Mark slowly raised the lantern higher, but did not have time to say anything. There was a sound in the woods behind them. Crackling. It was as if someone had stepped on a dry branch. Jessica swallowed hard. Logan clenched his hands into fists. Damn, he whispered. It's not an animal. Mark gritted his teeth, feeling a chill run down his spine. Someone was nearby. And he knew they were here. Mark slowly turned towards the sound, trying not to make any sudden movements. His fingers tightened on the flashlight, and the light ran through the trees, picking out gnarled trunks and tangled bushes from the darkness. The crash came again, closer. It wasn't the rustle of leaves or the crackle of falling branches. No. These were confident steps. Someone was walking, breaking twigs and dry leaves underfoot, as if deliberately not trying to be unnoticed. Who's there? Mark asked hoarsely, feeling his heart thumping in his chest. There was no response. Jessica sucked in a quiet breath through her teeth, clutching the metal mug in her hand so that her knuckles turned white. Logan slowly bent down to the ground and picked up a heavy stick. His face no longer expressed mockery, but only concentration and fear. Maybe they're tourists. Jessica tried to justify herself, but her voice faltered. What the hell kind of tourists? Logan whispered, not taking his eyes off the darkness. Mark took a step forward, shining the light further. And then he saw it. A silhouette could be seen between the trees, about 20 meters away from them. Tall. Hunched over. Human. But he didn't move. He just stood there. Hey! Mark shouted, trying to sound confident. Who are you? The silhouette did not respond. He didn't move. Maybe he can't hear us. Jessica whispered. Or he doesn't want to hear it, Logan muttered. Time seemed to freeze. It took a few seconds before Mark realized something was wrong. This man, he was standing too strangely. Unnatural. His head was slightly tilted to the side, and his shoulders were tense, as if he was listening. We need to get out of here, Logan said through gritted teeth. But as soon as he said that, the figure took a step forward. The muffled crunch of branches underfoot rang out in the eerie silence. They could see him better now. He was wearing simple clothes, dark trousers, a jacket, but his face was not visible. We're armed. Mark said sharply, clutching the flashlight in his hand. We're calling the police. But the man didn't stop. One more step. The sound of twigs crunching hurt my ears. Jessica put her hand to her mouth convulsively. Logan tensed, ready to fight or run. Mark raised his hand with the flashlight higher, but suddenly, the light started flashing. Damn it! He hit the body several times, but the flashlight continued to flicker, illuminating the figure in front of them in uneven flashes. And then they saw. The stranger had no shoes. His bare feet, covered with dirt and abrasions, looked as if he had been walking in the woods for weeks. But that wasn't the worst part. He kept walking. Step. One more step. Logan gripped the stick sharply, ready to strike, but suddenly, the man stopped. This time, Mark noticed how his chest was heaving, as if he was barely holding his breath. A few seconds of silence. And then, the figure slowly turned its head to the side. Not at them. A little further. Into the forest. Back to where they came from. "He's not alone," Jessica whispered. And that was the moment when the real panic began to roll in. Logan looked around frantically. Mark pressed his fingers into the flashlight so that they began to hurt. The stranger stood silently. And then, he did something they never expected. He just turned around and left. Not into the woods, not away from them. He left in the direction of their tents. And with every step, a crackling sound could be heard in the distance again. It was as if someone else was moving in the dark. Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Let's run," he whispered. But they didn't know which way. They froze like deer in the headlights. No one wanted to be the first to make a move. My gut instinct told me that any move could be fatal. Logan was the first to come out of his stupor. He abruptly turned around and, almost without making any sounds, moved back. Towards the car, he hissed. Jessica nodded and grabbed Mark's arm. Their camp was only a couple 100 meters away, but those meters now seemed endless. Step. One more step. The crunching of branches underfoot seemed louder than the beating of a heart. Something moved behind them. But no one looked back. Mark slowed down when he was almost at the tents. Logan glared at him. "Why are you up?" Mark raised his hand, gesturing for silence. He peered intently into the dark space between the trees. "There's something here." He didn't finish. The moon, coming out from behind the clouds, illuminated the clearing. And then they saw. The tents were torn up. Things are scattered on the ground. The pot with the leftovers is overturned. But the worst part is, someone's bare footprints going into the depths of the forest. Lots of footprints. They weren't alone. "Damn," Jessica gasped. She grabbed her backpack without even checking what was inside and rushed to the car. Logan didn't hesitate either. Mark paused for a moment, looking around as if trying to grasp something important. But at that moment, the sound came again. Somewhere nearby, just a few meters away, someone took a step. The crunch. Then another one. Someone was coming out of the shadows of the trees. They couldn't wait any longer. Mark turned around and rushed to the car. Jessica was already banging on the door. "Open it." Logan frantically pulled out the keys, but his fingers were shaking. Behind them, the crunching grew louder. Mark looked over his shoulder. A silhouette appeared out of the darkness. That's the one. But now there were others behind him. A lot. The headlights flashed on, illuminating a dozen barefoot figures standing among the trees. They were all watching. And none of them moved. The car started the first time. Logan slammed on the gas pedal. The tires screeched, and the car took off. But before they left the clearing, Mark looked back again. They did not follow them. Everyone just stood there. They were watching. Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. It wasn't until they reached a dirt road and the figures disappeared into the trees that he finally said, "Who was that?" "I don't care," Logan breathed, not relaxing his grip on the steering wheel. "The main thing is that we left." But Jessica remained silent. She was looking at her phone. Her hands were shaking. "What?" Mark asked. She turned the screen around. Photo. Taken just a few minutes ago, while they were still at the tents. The picture was blurry, but there were many more people standing in the shade of the trees behind their camp than they had seen at the last moment. They've been there all this time. We just waited. We waited for them to notice them. The car flew along the broken dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust. The headlights picked out sparse trees and roadside signs from the darkness, but the landscape was monotonous and seemed endless. Neither of them said a word. Even Logan, who usually couldn't keep his mouth shut, just gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Finally, Jessica broke the silence. Were they ordinary people? She sounded like she didn't believe her own question. Logan snorted. Have you seen them? Damn it, Jess, they came out of the woods barefoot in the middle of the night. Yes, but they didn't attack us, she said carefully. Because we noticed them, Mark muttered. He looked out the window, but he didn't see the road, but that clearing, their tents, and the shadows watching from the woods. Logan slammed on the steering wheel. We don't even know how many of them were there. Jessica looked at her phone again. She zoomed in on the photo. Now it became clear, the figures were standing not only behind the tents, but also among the trees, to the left and to the right. Around. They were surrounded. Mark clutched his head. We need to go to the police. And say what? Logan made an exasperated sound. Oh, officer, there were some barefoot morons in the woods looking at us, please figure it out. They were watching us, Logan. Mark exploded. So what? They're crazy sectarians, forest bums, I don't know shit. The main thing is that we got out. But Mark shook his head. You don't understand anything. He looked up. They didn't find us. Logan's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? We're the ones who came to where they live. The salon was silent again. Jessica automatically stroked the edge of her jacket, as if checking if it was still there. And then I noticed it. Spot. Dark. On her sleeve. She raised it to her eyes. Maroon brown. Dried blood. My heart clenched in my chest. She remembered that when she was packing her backpack, grabbing her clothes, she came across something wet, but in her haste she didn't pay attention. Jessica slowly picked up her phone and turned on the flashlight. She shone the light on the backpack. At the bottom, near the zipper, the fabric was also stained. Blood. She abruptly opened her backpack. What is it? Mark asked. Jessica didn't answer. Her hands were shaking, but she kept pulling things out one by one. T-shirt. Jacket. First aid kit. A plastic bag. Exhausted. It was immediately clear what was inside. Smell. Heavy, suffocating. Logan caught it, too. What the fuck is that? Jessica unwrapped the package without breathing. And she froze. Mark snatched it out of her hands. I unwound it to the end. In the glare of the lantern, it became visible. A piece of cloth. Dirty. Soaked in blood. But not just fabric. Sleeve. With a part of the arm inside. Jessica clapped her hand over her mouth. Logan slammed on the brakes, the car skidded, and it stopped sideways in the middle of the road. Where did you get this in your backpack? Jessica couldn't answer. She couldn't even remember when it got there. But one thing was clear. They weren't just watching. They left them a warning. The car was parked on an empty road, the engine was still running, but no one was moving. Mark was holding a piece of someone else's body in his hands, his fingers trembling as if it were white-hot steel. That's impossible, Jessica muttered, still staring at the mutilated sleeve. Logan pressed the accelerator pedal to the floor. We won't discuss it. We're just leaving. He didn't make it. Just as he was about to step on the gas, a sound was heard from the side. Twigs crackling. The rustle of footsteps. Jessica slowly turned to the window. The forest was dense and dark, but something was moving in it. Fuck, Mark hissed. It's them. Jessica frantically snapped her backpack shut and hugged it to her. A thud. From behind. Mark whirled around. Logan gripped the steering wheel so tightly that it felt like his skin was about to burst. The knock was repeated. But not from behind now. And on the side. On the roof. Someone was upstairs. Jessica shuddered, and at that moment the car lurched violently. It was as if someone had stepped from one side of the roof to the other. Logan didn't hesitate. He stepped on the gas sharply. The car lurched forward. A figure flashed by in the rearview mirror, but it was impossible to make out the details in the darkness. They didn't stop. Logan drove like he was being chased by death itself. The road took them to the highway, and finally, when the forest was far behind, he slowed down. They didn't talk. They just breathed. Alive. Jessica was still clutching her backpack tightly. To the next town, Mark managed. To the police. Logan nodded. But when they entered a small town and stopped at the first gas station, Jessica was the first to get out of the car. She couldn't breathe in the confined space. She took a couple of steps and suddenly felt that something was wrong. They're gone. They were far away. But the feeling wouldn't let go. She slowly turned her head towards the car. And I saw it. On the back window. Trace. It was as if someone had run their fingers over a fogged glass. But it wasn't just a stain. It was a word. We see. A chill pierced her spine. Logan. He looked at her. What? She raised her hand. She pointed at the glass. He got out of the car. I looked at it. Mark went out too. The three of them stood and watched. The letters were imprinted on the dirty glass, uneven but clear. No, Logan muttered. Jessica opened her backpack with shaking hands. They could still smell it. But when she unwrapped the package, there was no hand there. Just a piece of old rag. Soaked in blood. Mark recoiled. It can't be. Logan clenched his jaw. They knew what we'd find. They knew we'd be scared. Jessica closed her backpack. This is not a warning. She swallowed. It's an invitation. Logan turned away. We're leaving. He got into the car. Jessica and Mark got in too, but no one started the engine. In the distance, at the entrance to the city, several figures appeared in the lamplight. People. Without shoes. They just stood there. And they watched. Mr. Scary was no ordinary storyteller. His voice, like a rusty knife, bit into the broadcast every Friday at midnight. The radio show Real Nightmares has long become a cult for those obsessed with genuine horror. He didn't invent plots, he collected them. Letters from listeners, old newspaper clippings, audio cassettes with confessions that someone threw into his mailbox. All of this became the fuel for his stories. But no one knew that Mr. Scary himself was a former journalist whose career had been burned out by an investigation into a sect that turned people into obedient slaves through torture and neuro-linguistic programming. He survived by a miracle, but his left hand, mutilated by a blowtorch, remained forever hidden under a black glove. One day, a box was brought to him. Inside there are a dozen films marked Experiment Number 13. On the first recording, filled with crackles, a man's voice breaks into a scream. They make them forget. They're erasing it. It's like the brain is a sponge. Followed by children's laughter, unnatural, mechanical, as if recorded on a broken toy. Mr. Scary knew it wasn't a prank. He had seen this kind of thing before. Claire didn't want to go to an abandoned farm. But her brother, Jacob, disappeared there 3 days ago, leaving only a broken phone and a piece of paper with coordinates in the trailer. She found the bunker by accident, an iron door under a pile of planks, disguised as an old well. It smelled of formalin and rotten apples. The walls were covered with scratches, dates, names, crooked lines, as if someone was trying to draw a map of the maze. With a flashlight in her trembling hand, Claire went downstairs. The metal steps rang under his boots. Downstairs is a room lined with white tiles, like in a morgue. Syringes, vials of pink liquid, and a notebook were scattered on the table. The pages were filled with a single word, written in different handwriting, "I agree." The last entry is in a child's pencil, "Mom said I have to obey." But the uncle in the mask smells like a hospital. Claire didn't hear the door close. The lights went out. A hiss filled the air, and a pink mist crept across the floor. She rushed to the vent, but the grate wouldn't budge. A speaker clicked somewhere, "Welcome to correction. Stage 1, erasing fear." Shadows crawled out of the corners, figures in transparent suits and masks with smiling mouths. They were not carrying knives, but long needles and devices similar to portable EEGs. "We won't hurt you," a female voice said. "We will make you better." Claire punched the first one in the throat, but immediately felt a stab in the neck. The muscles failed. She was dragged through a hallway where photographs of children, adults, and the elderly hung on the walls. All with the same empty eyes. The last picture made her scream. Jacob was smiling at the camera, holding a sign, "Volunteer number 42. Full rehabilitation. Your brother has become part of the family," someone whispered in her ear. "You'll learn to be happy too." Mr. Scary was sitting in his studio, littered with tapes and folders marked "off the air." Claire's notes, delivered by an anonymous courier, lay in front of him, a dictaphone with a cracked screen and an envelope covered with brown spots that looked like blood. He pressed play, and the girl's voice, interrupted by sobs, filled the room. "They put something in the water, they make the children repeat the words. If you refuse, you disappear. Jacob. God, they broke him in a week." This was followed by sounds that made even Scar's back go cold, metallic screeching, the monotonous hum of instruments, screams, muffled as if underwater. And then, silence. He rewound the tape. At the end, barely audibly, the man said, "The Amethyst Protocol. Objects no longer distinguish truth from suggestion." Mr. Scary recognized the voice that he was driving along the highway, holding a pistol with traumatic cartridges in his pocket. Old habits. The coordinates led him to a dilapidated building of a former psychiatric clinic. The sign at the entrance also read, "Family Therapy Center." Inside there is a smell of mold and chemicals. The walls were covered with graffiti, hundreds of names written in marker, and the number 13 in a red circle. In the director's office, he found a safe that had been hacked decades ago. Inside there are folders with photos. Family portraits, parents, children, grandmothers. Everyone was smiling the same way, like mannequins. There are stamps on the back, "Successful integration." Below them are the lists, dosage, frequency of sessions, side effects. One document made him stop. Lotus series toxins, suppress the amygdala responsible for fear. With regular use, they cause complete dependence on the opinion donor. Next to it are graphs showing how, after 7 injections, 92% of the subjects signed any papers, even consent to organ rejection. Mr. Scary took out a flashlight. There was a door behind the safe. The basement turned out to be a laboratory. Vials of pink liquid, refrigerators with ampoules, electroencephalography machines, converted to something more sinister. There was a diary with notes on the table. Stage 3, Introduction to the Family. After 2 weeks of treatment, the mother herself brings the child to the procedures. It is important to isolate them from schools, churches, and doctors. Control through fear of illness. Object number 17 tried to resist. A double dose was administered. After 3 hours, he started kissing the operator's hands. Side effect, incontinence, aphasia. It's been disposed of. Suddenly the light flickered. Mr. Scary turned around. A woman in a white coat stood on the threshold. Her face was covered with a surgical mask, but he recognized the voice from the tape. "You don't know how to give up, do you?" She took out a syringe with a cloudy liquid. "We didn't want to involve you again. After you burned down our branch in '98. He retreated to the wall, groping for the light switch with his left hand. The glove slipped off, revealing the scars. "You." The woman froze. "You were supposed to die in that barn. Your favorite tactic saved me." He jerked the switch sharply. Darkness. Shot. The glass flasks broke. Fear is a great incentive to our UNDMR. Scary opened the hard drive hidden behind a panel in the laboratory. The files were encrypted, but a series of dates, the 13th of each month, turned out to be the key. Inside, financial statements, fake quality certificates, and correspondence with the charity foundation, Bright Hearts. "Damn it," he hissed, comparing the documents. The foundation supplied free antidepressants to poor areas. But the instructions for the drugs read in small print: "Take daily, dissolve in a warm liquid." The attachments showed that each batch of tablets contained the toxin Lotus 7, which was activated when heated. Psychiatric supervisors on the ground convinced families that the medicine should be drunk with tea. Scary found a video report. At boarding school, children drew identical symbols, spirals with a dot in the center. The teacher in the frame was smiling. After 3 months of taking them, they became so obedient. Claire didn't scream when the needle entered the vein for the 5th time. The pink liquid didn't burn anymore. My body was numb. She was transferred to the adaptation zone, a room with padded walls, where the same footage was broadcast around the clock on TV, happy families eating breakfast in unison. "You have to understand, we help people," said the voice from the speaker. "And Jacob?" "What is it?" she whispered. "Your brother. He's special." She was taken out into the hallway for a walk. The guard, whose face was hidden by a respirator, led her past the windows. She saw Jacob in one of the offices. He was sitting at his desk, studying graphs, and talking on the phone. "No, the party for the Rasvit Center is ready. Tell them to double the dose for teenagers." Claire rushed to the door, but the guard injected her with a sedative. Before consciousness drifted away, she heard her brother's voice. "I'm sorry, sis. But you came by yourself. So she's ready to be perfect." Details of the experiment. Lotus 7 causes a chemical dependence similar to heroin. Withdrawal symptoms manifest as panic attacks, which cause victims to beg for a cure. Families are recruited through crisis situations, layoffs, illnesses, deaths. They are given sponsors from the foundation, who become their only support. Those who resist are declared mentally ill. The local media, bought by the sect, publish revealing articles with fake interviews of neighbors that MR. Scary quickly left the building, taking with him a hard drive and several folders with incriminating documents. The night was dark, the air smelled damp, and every step echoed hollowly in the corridors of the abandoned clinic. He knew that he couldn't stay here for long. The sect clearly hadn't given up their habits, and they could come for him at any minute. When he got to the car, he threw the loot into the passenger seat and started the engine. Squinting in the rear-view mirror, he caught his reflection, tired, scarred by years of fear and struggle. He had already been a part of this war once, but then he had lost. Now he had a chance to finish what he had started. Claire opened her eyes in the dark. My head was buzzing, my muscles ached, and my lips were dry, as if after a long binge. It took her a moment to realize where she was. The room looked like a hospital ward, a metal cot, empty walls, and the barely audible hum of ventilation. There was a screen in the corner, but it wasn't on yet. There was a glass of water and 2 white pills on the table next to it. "Drink up. This will help," a voice came from somewhere above. She looked up at the speaker in the corner. "You're disoriented, that's okay. You've been through a lot of stress, Claire. Drink some water and you'll feel better." She didn't touch the glass. "You don't have to be afraid. We take care of you here. Everything we do is for your own good." Claire was silent. "We understand that it's difficult for you." Jacob didn't believe it at first either. But then he realized that this was the only way to real freedom. At the mention of her brother, something inside her turned over. "What did you do to him?" Her voice was hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in days. "He found his calling. He saw the truth. As you will see." The screen blinked and a video appeared on it. A family of 4, a mother, father and 2 children, were sitting at the dining table. Everyone was smiling. But the smiles were too identical. Their movements were as precise as dolls. They ate in perfect rhythm, as if they were following an imperceptible command. They're happy. They're healthy. They don't know fear, anxiety, or pain. They're free. Claire clenched her fists. This is not freedom. This. You don't understand yet. But you'll understand. Everyone understands. Sooner or later. The door opened. A man in a white coat entered. "Good morning, Claire. We need to run some tests." She did not resist when she was lifted from the bed. But a plan was already forming in her mind. Mr. Scary was sitting in his apartment, staring at his laptop screen. He found something really scary in the documents. The Bright Hearts Foundation wasn't just distributing drugs. He has funded dozens of private clinics and rehabilitation centers across the country. In all these places, the same program was used: the gradual psychological withdrawal of patients, the introduction of addiction, the erasure of personality traits. But there was one more detail. Among the lists of successfully rehabilitated, he found one familiar name. Claire Hayes. Status: integration is completed. Stage 2. Scary clenched his fists. They haven't completely broken it yet. So he still has time. He ran an old encryption program and sent copies of the documents to 3 of his contacts, journalists he had once trusted. If something happens, the truth will come out. And then he picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The beeps went on endlessly. Then a voice rang out. "You know you're going to get killed if you keep digging, right?" "I'm already dead," Scary replied. "Where are they keeping her?" There was a pause on the line. "You don't just want to know, do you? You want to get her out. Damn it, tell me." Garden, 12 Branch. "The security is serious. Cameras, security passes, self-contained doors. If you climb, you won't come out alive. Then I'll have to make them open the door for me themselves." He hung up the phone. Mr. Scary checked the clip, and there was a full magazine. In his pocket were 2 chloral hydrate capsules, a quick way to put the guards to sleep. He was working alone, and that was the only option. If he breaks in with a gun, he'll kill 2 of them, and the other 3 will set off an alarm. And if he goes unarmed, they'll just break him. The Garden, 12 Branch was located in the former sanatorium building. High walls, cameras on every corner. Login using biometrics. If he wants to get inside, he needs to be taken there. He got into the rented van and opened his laptop. The perimeter cameras are connected to the cloud. A small mistake in the protocols, and he had access. He saw the guards patrolling the area. There were 2 men standing at the front entrance, armed with tasers and batons. There were no guns. It was easier to control patients that way. There are at least 4 people inside. He took a deep breath. It's time. Claire felt her body weaken. She was kept here for more than a week. Scheduled meals, metered injections, conversations that became softer and calmer every day. She wasn't broken. But she felt like the system was trying to bend her. She was taken out for examination again today. The room was white and empty. There was a monitor on the wall showing her heart rate. There was a tray of food on the table. Boiled chicken, some rice, a glass of juice. She looked at him, but she didn't eat. "You have to eat, Claire. It is important." The doctor was sitting opposite. "Food is a concern. We can't take care of you if you don't take care of yourself." "Where's my brother?" "He went through the process. He's happy. We're not forcing you, Claire. All you have to do is accept help." She looked at him. "You're lying." The doctor sighed and nodded to someone outside the door. Two orderlies entered, their faces devoid of emotion. "If you don't want to volunteer, we'll have to help you." They grabbed her by the arms. She jerked, but there was almost no strength left. One of the paramedics unclenched her jaw, the other took a syringe. "Just a little bit. Just to make the process easier." The needle entered the neck, and the world began to swim. But before her eyes closed, she heard a crash. Loud as a hammer striking metal. Scary acted quickly. A smoke bomb in the ventilation, the siren beeped, calling the guards to the main corridor. The doors locked automatically, but he had already found a weak spot in the system. The left entrance to the lower level. He tore off the grate and climbed inside. A narrow, dirty tunnel led to the basement. Dark walls, concrete floor, the smell of bleach. The light was blinking. There was a cage on the right. There were people inside. Dirty, in rags, with empty eyes. Some were trembling, others were just staring into space. He came closer. A woman in her 40s looked up. "You're not one of them." "No," he whispered. "Then kill us." He clenched his fists. "No. This is not the end of them." He looked at the castle. Standard electronic. He knew he only had a few minutes. But he also knew that Claire was here. And he won't leave without her. Claire was awakened by a crash. Everything was blurry, but consciousness returned faster than expected. She felt that her hands were not tied. Mistake. She realized that this was her only chance. The orderly turned away, checking the monitor. She jerked around, grabbed a fork from a tray, and stabbed it into his neck. He screamed, and blood splattered on her robe. The second orderly grabbed her by the hair, but she was already moving. Knee in the groin, elbow in the throat. He coughed, clutching at his throat, and she lifted the stool and slammed it into his head. A dull crunch. He fell without moving. She was breathing heavily, looking at their bodies. But there was no time. She took the robe off one of them and pulled it on. And she went out into the corridor. Scary opened the lock. "Go ahead. Quickly." The woman got out first. The others hesitated. "The exit is on the north side. Stick to the shadows." They didn't respond, but he could see that some of them were already moving. He turned around. And he saw her. Claire was standing at the end of the hallway. The eyes are dilated. There's a bloody knife in his hands. They looked at each other. "We're leaving," he said. She nodded. "It's time to end this shit." Scary took a step towards Claire, checking her condition. She looked pale but confident. There was no panic or weakness on her face. Just clenched fists and a frantic breathing rhythm. "Can you walk?" he asked. "Yes." He nodded. "Then let's get out." The smell of blood and smoke filled the corridors. The siren wailed again, but this time its tone changed. "The automatic lock is activated." "Shit," he said. He knew they had no more than 5 minutes left before reinforcements would rush in. "We have to move faster," he said, pointing to the stairs on the left. Claire took a step forward, but suddenly froze. She looked away. There, in one of the open rooms, a boy was lying on a bed. He couldn't have been more than 7. Thin body, sunken cheeks, skin almost white. His eyes opened, but he didn't move. "Claire, let's go." But she was already walking towards him. Scary clenched his jaw. That was her limit. She couldn't just leave. She put her hand on his shoulder. "Baby?" The boy's eyes twitched. "Help me." Her heart sank. "We'll get you out." She picked him up in her arms. The body was light, almost weightless. Scary swore. Now it was even more difficult. But he didn't say a word. They ran out into the hallway. The siren muffled his footsteps, but he knew the guards were on their way. 3 minutes. "The door is on the right," he said. Claire walked quickly, clutching the baby tightly. Scary peered around the corner. 2 of them. Automatic batons, bulletproof vests. He took a deep breath. And he fired. The first bullet hit the left guard in the neck, the second in the temple of the other. They fell before they even realized what had happened. "Come on." They crossed the hall and jumped out into a side corridor. The door to the outside was right in front of them. But Scary stopped. Claire felt his hand grab her shoulder. "What?" "Cameras. They already know where we are. If we go out now, we'll be shot like dogs." He looked around. To the left was the security control panel. He took a few quick steps and pulled out a small transmitter from his pocket. Claire realized what he was going to do. "Will you hack into their system?" "No," he said, attaching the device to the panel. "I'll burn it." As soon as he activated the transmitter, the wires closed inside. The hallway lit up with a flash for a second, and the light flickered. And then the whole complex was plunged into darkness. Now. They rushed to the exit. The doors were electronic, and now their locks were disabled. Scary slammed his shoulder into the door, which gave way. The cold night air hit my face. Claire ran out after him, holding the boy in her arms. They were free. But that wasn't all. There were screams behind them. They turned around. Those whom Scary had freed were running out of the building. The woman he saw first was leading the others. They didn't run. They were walking. Calmly. Purposefully. Like an army. Claire felt her body tense up. "They are. Are they following us?" Scary looked at them. And he nodded. "They want to finish what they started." Claire felt a strange tension in the air. These people. They no longer looked like victims. Their faces were blank. They went outside and stopped, surrounding Scary and Claire with the boy. "What's going on?" Her voice was trembling. Scary tightened his grip on the gun. "I do not know." The woman who was walking in front looked directly at them. And she said, "We can't leave." Claire blinked uncomprehendingly. "What? You think you saved us, but you just let us out." She took a step forward. "And now you have to understand, not everything that looks like a prison is a prison." Claire felt her body go cold. She looked at the boy in her arms. He wasn't so weak anymore. His fingers tightened convulsively on her clothes. His lips twitched. And he smiled. "Thanks for helping us out." Claire understood. But it was too late. They all rushed at them at the same time. The darkness closed in. 3 weeks later, a terrible tragedy was reported on the news. The closed medical laboratory was destroyed, the staff is dead. and dozens of patients who were kept inside disappeared. So far, no one has found them. But every night in different parts of the city, people disappeared without a trace. And surveillance cameras sometimes recorded something. A group of people moving in the dark. Calmly. Purposefully. Like an army. The Riddle family moved into a remote mansion, bought at auction after the bankruptcy of the previous owners. The house, designed as an ideal shelter, was surrounded by a high fence with barbed wire, and its ground floor windows were barred. "This is security," Claire, a mother of two, told herself as she stared at the cracks in the concrete of the driveway. Her husband, Greg, a former military man, praised the sturdy doors and camera system. But their teenage daughter, Emily, noticed the first discrepancy. Someone's tools were left in the garage: saws, axes, all perfectly cleaned of rust, as if they had been used the day before. The son, 10-year-old Jacob, found a toy bear with a gouged eye in the garden. There was a microchip inside it. Greg, thinking it was part of an old alarm system, threw it away. But that night, Emily woke up to the sound of footsteps on the stairs. There was nothing on the cameras in the app except static. In the morning, she found a dirty handprint on the windowsill of her room, too large to be a child's. A week later, Claire started rummaging through the basement, trying to find boxes of dishes. She heard a whisper behind the wall of shelves. Leaning her ear, she heard a man's voice, "Don't make any noise. They're listening." When Greg took down the shelves, there was a frosted glass door behind them. Beyond it is a room with an armchair chained to the floor and walls covered with scratches. There were clumps of hair on the floor and an empty injection package labeled midazolam, sedative. Greg, ignoring his wife's panic, called the police. While the guards were examining the room, Emily secretly took a picture of a barcode with numbers on the wall. An internet search led her to a forum of former employees of a private prison that was closed after the torture scandal. One of the posts read, "They have moved the equipment. Look for black marks." Meanwhile, Jacob, playing in the garden, came across a trapdoor. Inside there is a tunnel leading to the bunker. There was a map of the area on the wall with house markers and dates. The last date coincided with the day the Riddles moved in. There was a laptop in the corner. When I turned on, the screen was filled with video files, each one showed different families living in the house. The footage was captured with hidden cameras. In the last video, a masked man methodically cut a doll with a knife, repeating, "It's your turn soon." In the evening, when Greg was checking the perimeter, the cameras suddenly went out of order. A squeaky voice came from the security system speakers, "Welcome home." At the same moment, the locks on all the doors clicked. The Riddle family froze when they heard the click of locks. Greg made a dash for the front door, but the lever wouldn't budge. "The system is blocked from the outside," he muttered, pulling a pistol from his holster. Claire hugged Jacob, whose eyes were wide with fear. Emily, with trembling hands, opened the laptop from the bunker. The screen went out, leaving only the inscription, "The rules of the game have changed." The police, who were examining the room in the basement, did not respond to calls on the radio. Greg checked the window and noticed that their cars had disappeared from the yard. "They're not real cops," he hissed, remembering how one of the officers avoided eye contact. Emily remembered the barcode with the numbers. "This is the prisoner's ID," she whispered, scrolling through the browser history on her phone. The forum of former prison guards was full of threats against traitors, but one post stood out: "If you find black marks, run. They are testing new methods." Jacob tugged at his mother's sleeve. "The tunnel from the garden. It leads to the forest." Greg nodded, smashing the window with his jacket-wrapped fist. "Quiet. They're somewhere nearby," he ordered, helping the family out. In the garden, under the howling wind, the trapdoor to the bunker gaped like a trap. "No," Greg stopped his son, "this is the entrance for them. We need to cross the fence. They crept along the fence until Greg found the area where the barbed wire had been cut. A branch snapped behind him. Greg turned around, but the shadows were silent. As Claire climbed over the fence, a figure in black burst out of the darkness. Greg fired into the air, and the man recoiled, disappearing into the night. When they reached the road, they saw the lights of the gas station. Emily, panting, dialed 911. "We need help. This is Emily Riddle. We're in a house on Old Mill Road. We are being persecuted." Suddenly, the connection was interrupted. The phone vibrated, an unknown number. On the screen is a screenshot of their escape from surveillance cameras. "Bad choice," the text read. At the police station, where they were taken an hour later, a detective with bags under his eyes grinned. "Your house belonged to Securitech, a company that conducted experiments on mind control. They rent out the mansion to families, to watch them break down in fear." He held out a photo. The man in the mask, the one from the video, turned out to be an ex-employee of a closed prison. "He's dead. He hanged himself in his cell 3 months ago." The next day, when the Riddles returned for their belongings under guard, they saw that all the evidence had disappeared. The room in the basement is filled with bricks, the bunker is filled with concrete. Securitech denied involvement, and local sheriffs advised not to invent theories. Now, sitting in a rented apartment, Emily is updating the forum. A new anonymous post, "Family number 13 failed the test. Get ready for recruitment number 14. The attached photo shows their house, and a silhouette with a knife is barely visible in the window. The Riddles were sitting in a rented apartment, trying to recover from their ordeal. But there was no peace. Every night they woke up to sounds that seemed to haunt them even here. Creaking floorboards, rustling outside the door, quiet laughter coming from the empty hallway. Claire began to notice that things in the house were moving on their own. Either the cup will end up on the other side of the table, or the family photo will turn face down. Jacob, who was usually so talkative, was now silent, staring at one point, as if he saw something that the others couldn't see. Emily, despite her fear, continued to dig into the information. She found old newspaper articles about the closed prison, which mentioned experiments on prisoners. In an interview, a former guard who wished to remain anonymous talked about black tags, special codes that were used to track test subjects. "They don't stop," he said. "Even after death. They will always find you." One morning, Claire found a piece of paper on the kitchen table with the words neatly written on it, "You forgot something important." Below the text was a drawing of the plan of their old house with a marker in the corner of the basement. Greg, despite the protests of his family, decided to return. "We need to know what it is," he said, clutching a flashlight in his hand. After returning to the mansion, they went down to the basement. In the corner where the walled-up room used to be, there was now a gaping hole in the wall. Beyond it is a narrow passage leading into the interior. The air was damp and heavy, smelling of mold and something chemical. There were scratches on the walls, as if someone was desperately trying to get out. They found a small room at the end of the tunnel. There was a notebook on the table, covered with shaky handwriting. The last entry read, "They know that I know. If anyone finds it, run. They're not human. They were never human." There were empty vials of an unknown substance on the floor, and a calendar with dates circled in red hung on the wall. The last date was a week later. Greg looked around the room and found a small metal box in the corner. Inside is a folder with photos. Each one shows different families who lived in the house before them. The last picture was of the Riddle family, taken through their bedroom window. On the back is the inscription, "Family number 13. The test is completed. The results are satisfactory." Suddenly the light went out. A whisper came from the darkness, "You shouldn't have found this." Greg lit a lantern, but the room was empty. Only there was a new piece of paper on the table. The game continues. When they returned to the apartment, they tried to forget what they had seen. But the next day, Emily discovered that her laptop had turned on its own. A video was open on the screen. The record shows their house, but not the one they left. The windows were smashed, the walls were covered in soot, and Jacob's toys were lying on the floor, torn apart. In the center of the frame stood a masked man holding a doll with a gouged eye. He slowly turned to the camera and whispered, "We are waiting for you." Since then, the Riddles began to notice that they were being watched. Unfamiliar cars were parked outside their house, and shadows were flickering in the windows of neighboring buildings. One night, Jacob woke his parents screaming. He claimed to have seen a masked man outside the window looking directly at him. When Greg ran outside, there was no one there. But there was a dirty handprint on the windowsill. Claire started rummaging through old documents, trying to find a connection between Securitech and their house. She discovered that the mansion was built on the site of an old psychiatric hospital, closed after a scandal involving the disappearance of patients. In the archives, there was a photo of the head doctor, a man in a mask, similar to the one they saw in the video. One morning they received a package. There was a teddy bear inside, just like the one Jacob found in the garden. This time, both of his eyes were ripped out. Inside is a note, "See you soon." The Riddles knew it was useless to run. They were part of something bigger, something that would never let them go. Every night they heard footsteps outside the door, and every day they found new gifts. And the scariest thing was that they began to doubt the reality of what was happening. Maybe it's all just a figment of their imagination. Maybe they've been part of the experiment for a long time, without even realizing it. But one night, after everyone went to bed, Emily heard a voice from the baby monitor speaker they had left in Jacob's room. "Sleep well," a man's voice whispered. "We're already here." She rushed to her brother's room, but he was asleep. Only on the wall above his bed was written in red paint, "Family number 13." He Riddles could no longer ignore what was happening. Every day brought new evidence that they were being watched, harassed, and tested. But now they decided to fight. Greg, using his military skills, began to develop a plan. They couldn't just sit around and wait to be pushed to their limits. It was necessary to act. Emily, despite her fear, continued to explore the connection between Securitech and their house. She found old drawings of the mansion, which showed that there was a whole network of tunnels under the house leading to other buildings in the area. The map they found in the bunker showed not only their house, but also neighboring buildings, including an abandoned school and an old factory. "It's not just an experiment," she said. "It's a system. They control the whole area." Claire, meanwhile, contacted a journalist who once wrote about the scandal surrounding Securitech. He agreed to help, but warned, "If you are right, then this is much more than just corporate experiments. It may be related to people who will stop at nothing." One evening, when Greg was checking the perimeter of the apartment, he noticed that an unmarked van was parked behind their house. Two men in black were sitting inside, watching their windows. Greg took a picture of them and sent it to a journalist. An hour later, he called back, "These are former employees of a private military company. They are connected with Securitech. Be careful." The Riddles decided to strike back. Using the information Emily had gathered, they made a plan to infiltrate the abandoned school marked on the map. They assumed that there might be a control center there, or at least a part of the system that monitors them. At night, armed with lanterns and cameras, they went there. The school was huge, with broken windows and peeling paint. Silence reigned inside, broken only by the creaking of floorboards underfoot. There were old posters on the walls and broken desks in the classrooms. But in the basement they found what they were looking for, a room filled with monitors. The screens show surveillance footage from their home, apartment, and even the streets they walked on. There was a server in the corner, flashing lights. Emily plugged in her laptop and started copying data. Suddenly, the face of a masked man appeared on the screens. "Did you think you could stop us?" he said. "You're wrong." The monitors went off, and footsteps sounded in the hallway. Greg grabbed the family and led them out the back door. They ran through the woods until they reached the car. At home, they found that their apartment had been trashed. It was written on the wall in red paint, "The game is over." But the Riddles didn't give up. They passed the copied data to the journalist who published the investigation. The article caused a scandal, and Securitech had to publicly justify itself. But the Riddles knew that this was just the beginning. A few days later, they received a new message. "Did you think you had one? We're just getting started." This time, a photo of their new apartment, taken from the inside, was attached to the message. They realized that it was useless to run. The only way out is to keep fighting. Now they live in constant readiness. Every day brings new threats, but they know they have to stick together. Because if they break down, they will become just another family that has disappeared without a trace. And they don't want to be just a number in someone's experiment. They want to survive. The house was cheap. Too much. The realtor mentioned previous owners with unusual hobbies, but Mia didn't ask. The first alarm bell was the door to the basement, triple locks, steel fortifications. Inside, she found a glass chamber with a floor covered with dark flakes and a dusty magazine on the table. Entry 1, Subject 3 did not tolerate the X connection well. Seizures, paranoia. Note, increased sedation. Entry 17, auditory hallucinations confirmed. They call it the whisper protocol. Mia thought it was a stalker joke. But at night she was awakened by a piercing hum, as if from a dental drill. The sound came from the ventilation. She followed him to the garage, where a hidden panel opened, revealing rows of syringes labeled Neuro V9 and a flickering monitor recording her bedroom. The police didn't find anything. "Old stuff," they said. But one officer muttered, "They used to rent a lab here. Biomedical research. Closed after incidents." Mia's coffee tasted like metal in the morning. By noon, his vision was blurred. There was a note on the refrigerator, not her handwriting. "Phase 2 has begun. Observe and report." The migraine started. And voices. Not in my head, but out of the walls. Distorted whispers, babbling numbers, addresses, her credit card details. She disassembled the ventilation. There was a microphone inside, warm to the touch. There was a forum in the browser. Bookmarks, Neuro V9 trials, remote cognitive programming. Recent comments. Subject 8, women, 28, demonstrates compliance. Start sleep deprivation. We are uploading new audio stimuli. The goal, the fear of suffocation. Mia packed her things, but the car wouldn't start. A message appeared on the screen, "Submission is required. Return to Area A." She ran. The neighboring houses were empty, the windows boarded up. A black van was waiting by the highway. A man in a bathrobe with a tablet went outside. "Miss Carter. Let's discuss your lease agreement." She ran into the woods. There was a bunker in the clearing with the door ajar. Inside there are monitors with views of her rooms, a refrigerator with Neuro V9 test tubes and a folder, Subject 8, Mia Carter. Purpose, testing of forced obedience through subconscious audio signals. There was a gun in the closet. The shot echoed through the bunker. The man in the bathrobe fell down. Mia took his phone. Last message, eliminate Subject 8. Prepare the laboratory for relocation. She drove the van until she ran out of gas. Now she lives in the wilderness. But sometimes my ears ring at night. And when she checks her phone, turned off, without a battery, a notification lights up on the screen. Mia changed her name, her hair, even her fingerprints. An underground surgeon from the former Omega laboratory took double the fee. But after a month of silence, in her squalid apartment above an auto repair shop, the lights flickered on. The lamp didn't burn out, rhythmically, like Morse code, 3 short, 3 long. She tore the socket out of the wall. I found a coin-sized device in the dashboard, Omega Tracker V.3. There is a drop of blood on the case. Not hers. That same night, a box appeared on the doorstep. Inside is a child's toy, a robot dog with broken paws. An envelope is clutched in his teeth. Photo of Mia sleeping on the new couch. On the back. Phase 3, Adaptation. Only one of us will survive. Run more cheerfully. She disassembled the robot. Inside is a flash drive with data, lists of subjects, their addresses, diagnoses. Her name was highlighted in red, unstable. An enhanced protocol is recommended. The next file is a video. A room with a mirrored floor. People in handcuffs, connected to servers through pins in the spine. One of them raised his head, and it was the surgeon who had changed her face. They know, Mia realized. But instead of panicking, I turned on my burner phone. The very first text message. Unknown, Dr. Rains is alive. And he wants the final report on Subject 8. She threw away the SIM card, but laughter rang in her head. Not through the speakers, but right in the ears, as after Neuro V9. The next day at the store, the cashier handed over the check. There is a handwritten note on it. Your bus to the Last Chance station departs at 1800 hours. Mia didn't go. Instead, she hacked the mail of a former laboratory housemate. The drafts contain a letter. They have implemented chips through vaccines. They're testing on refugees. If you're reading this, I'm already dead. Look for the Omega platform in Zone 6. Zone 6. An abandoned shopping mall on the outskirts. Mia entered through the ventilation. Inside is an operating room with people in comas. Their dreams are on the screens, nightmares assembled from memories. She found the server room. Her face is on the monitor. Log files, Subject 8. Escape attempt number 12. 97% of reality simulation is completed. Preparing for the final iteration. A shutter clicked behind him. Mia turned around. Dr. Rains, with a bullet scar on his neck, was holding a gun. Congratulations, you have passed the selection. Your fear turned out to be delightfully tenacious. Is this a simulation? Mia whispered. No. It's a market. Rains pointed the gun at the screen. Every one of your nightmares was bought by the military. And now it's time to wake up. Shot. Did you think that a bullet would stop the protocol? He grinned, touching the sensor on her temple. Your consciousness has already been uploaded to the Omega platform. Even death here is just a parameter. The screens around them came to life, showing thousands of faces, other subjects whose brains were hanging in cloud servers, generating nightmares for auctions on the dark web. Mia noticed her profile, Subject 8. Resistance level, critical. Recommended, deep stimulation of the limbic system. Why do you need my nightmares? She whispered, trying to move her fingers. Fear is the best virus. Rains ran his hand over the hologram where the military from different countries were betting. Your phobias are training AI to suppress rebellions. But you broke the patterns. Suddenly, the screens crackled. An emergency hatch flashed in the corner of the room. It was blown up by a woman in a torn dressing gown, with a spike in the back of her head. Run. She tossed Mia a knife. They don't control the physical level. Mia cut the straps and ran after the stranger through the maze of pipes. The woman introduced herself as Laura, a former Omega programmer who had implanted a chip blocker. "Your body is in a cryo chamber on level B7, Laura said, hacking into the elevator. "But if you destroy the core of the platform, the simulation will collapse." The server room resembled a cathedral made of black silicon. In the center was a brain in a neural network, pulsing like a jellyfish, the core of an AI that feeds on fear. Laura connected the explosives, but the screens blared, extermination protocol activated. The walls began to crawl, turning into a digital web. Dr. Rains materialized from the pixels, his body distorted like a bad signal. "You're trapped in the metaverse, Mia. Your every thought is my code." Laura shouted. "Remember something real. Something that is not in their database." Mia closed her eyes. Memory, the smell of grandma's pie mixed with oil paint, she painted with it in the old barn. The world shook. Rains screamed, his pixels disintegrating. "Nostalgia," Laura whispered. "He can't emulate unique emotions." Mia focused on her memories, the first kiss, the tears from the bow, the scratch of the cat. "The universe has cracked." She grabbed Laura and jumped into the rift. Mia and Laura are currently in a bunker in Alaska. They hacked part of Omega's data. The Whisper protocol is just a branch. The main project is the mirror, cloning the minds of the elite into artificial bodies. But yesterday the radio picked up a strange signal. A voice that sounded like Mia was begging for help. "The coordinates lead to an island that is not on the maps." Laura wipes the gun. "It's a trap." Mia looks at the photo of the surgeon. His body was found in Zone 6, but the signal was coming from where he physically could not be. Or an invitation. She loads the gun. They're still playing cat and mouse. "And if it's another you?" Laura turns on the hologram. The island map glows a poisonous green. "Then I'll give myself a piece of advice: run faster. There's a recording looping somewhere on the air. Phase 4, replication. Welcome home, Subject 8. Mia clutched a photo of the island in her hand. The satellite image showed a piece of land in the Bering Sea designated as a nature reserve. Laura spread out on the table the security schematics she had extracted from Omega's servers before escaping. Thermal sensors around the perimeter, patrols every 2 hours, she pointed at the dots on the map. But there is a blind spot in the eastern part. Old tunnels. By plane to Nome, then by stolen boat, 6 hours in an icy fog. The island greeted them with the crash of waves on basalt rocks. The tunnels turned out to be an abandoned entrance to an underground complex. The rusty rails led deep into the mountain. The first difference from simulation is the smell. A pungent chemical stench, a mixture of chlorine and burnt flesh. Instead of holograms, there are concrete corridors with wires hanging like vines. Laura connected the portable scanner to the switchboard. Active cameras in Sector C movement. 20 people. They moved shadow by shadow. The laboratory unit opened behind a steel door with a biometric lock. Laura attached the stolen Raynos chip, a red light. "We need a fingerprint," Mia whispered, but then footsteps came from around the corner. 2 guards in black uniforms with the Omega security logo on their chevrons. The shots from the silencers were deafening in the narrow corridor. One fell, the other managed to press the alarm button. The siren blared, the flashing lights flooded everything with red. "Run!" Laura sprinted off in the direction of the maintenance tunnels. Mia, hiding herself, noticed the inscription on the nearest door: quarantine. Level 4-inch. Inside there are rows of glass chambers. People were handcuffed to their bunks, with bundles of electrodes reaching for their heads. The monitors were showing EEG, beta waves were going through the roof. Alive. Laura ran her hand over the screen. They put them in a state of controlled psychosis. "Look." On the table are syringes with a drug Mia knows, Neuro V9. An inhibitor of the prefrontal cortex. The roar of engines in the tunnel. Mia looked out. An armored loader with a machine gun was crawling along the rails. "We need a sample," Laura shouted, grabbing the syringe. They ran out into the next corridor when the bullets began to crumble the concrete. Section B turned out to be a testing ground. There are dogs in cages with chips implanted in their skulls. One, with broken paws, rushed to the bars. Her eyes were covered with eyesore. The same symptoms as the subjects. Mia stopped when she heard a metallic screech behind her. Dr. Rains exited the elevator, shielding himself with a ballistic glass shield. The scar on his neck was pulled together by a coarse thread. "You're persistent, Miss Carter. But now you're part of the experiment." He pressed a button on his wristband. Mia screamed as the steel door slammed shut, cutting off Laura. Gas with a pungent menthol smell hit the ventilation. Modified V9, Rains pressed the mask to his face. "Cause paralysis in 30 seconds. Mia grabbed a syringe from her pocket as she fell and plunged it into her thigh. The antidote stolen from quarantine burned like fire. She jumped up before Rains could figure it out and stabbed him in the gap between the shield and the bulletproof vest. Laura broke down the door, throwing a thermal charger into the slot. Together they reached the server room. Instead of a pulsating brain, there are rows of hard drives labeled Whisper Protocol. Version 2.1 inch. The data is here, Laura plugged in the drive. All tests, lists of those chipped through vaccines. Explosives with a timer for 5 minutes. They ran to the exit, bypassing the mopping up area. On the surface, by the boat, Laura took out a satellite phone. "We have enough evidence to burn them." But as they sailed away, Mia looked at the syringe in her hand. The Neuro V9 label hid the fine print, property of the Pentagon. The MK Ultra 2.0 project. "This is just the beginning," she whispered, watching the island disappear into the fog. Encrypted files were already flying somewhere on the air, to the servers of independent media, into the hands of hacktivists. But they found a flash drive marked Mirror in Rain's pocket. At launch, the video showed a copy of Mia, a girl with her face, reading a report in front of the generals. Replication, Laura realized. They clone agents. Mia and Laura, hiding in a safe house in Alaska, systematized the data from the island. The evidence was irrefutable: contracts with defense companies, records of human experiments, lists of refugees who had been vaccinated. Laura, using anonymous channels, leaked the information to independent journalists from The Guardian and WikiLeaks. A week later, the headlines blew up the network: Modern MK Ultra, how the Pentagon is testing mind control. The government denied everything, calling the materials fake, but a wave of outrage swept the world. The courts were flooded with lawsuits from victims whose faces flashed in laboratory reports. Under pressure from Congress, hearings were held. The generals were lost in questions, and one of the Omega scientists, afraid of prison, became a witness for the prosecution. Dr. Rains has been put on the international wanted list. His photo hung on every corner, but his body was never found, only traces of blood in an abandoned laboratory on the island. Mia sometimes thought she saw him in the crowd, but it was always someone else. Paranoid habits became her new norm: checking rooms for bugs, changing routes, encrypted correspondence. The Mirror Project turned out to be a training program for doppelgangers, not clones, but people altered by plastic surgery and brainwashing. Laura hacked into the database and found politicians and journalists among the targets. They sent warnings to everyone, but no one responded. Only Senator McCarthy abruptly withdrew from the election, citing family circumstances. Laura joined an old hacktivist chat and created a network of like-minded people. They found clandestine laboratories, posing as eco-activists, and sabotaged the supply of drugs. Mia, on the other hand, focused on helping victims, those whose psyche was broken by Neuro V9. She raised money for rehabilitation, found psychologists who were willing to work anonymously. One night, while checking her mail, Mia found an email marked, "From the one you killed." The attached video showed Rains wearing a mask, with a scarred face. "You're naive, Mia. Omega is just a branch. The tree grows in the shadow of the budget." Documents with the logo of the private military company Blackthorn Incorporated flashed off screen, and then the screen went blank. Laura, having traced the IP address, logged on to a server in Switzerland. After hacking it, they saw contracts for cognitive weapons for regimes that even the UN was afraid to name. But instead of another leak, they copied everything into an encrypted archive. "It's not our time," Laura said. "But it'll come in handy one day." A year later, Mia, under a new name, works as a nurse at a clinic for veterans. Sometimes she sees a familiar gleam in the eyes of patients, an emptiness built up over years of control. She teaches them how to draw, just like she used to with her grandmother. "Art therapy," says the reports. In fact, it's a test. You can't fake real emotions. Laura lives in a bunker in Norway, surrounded by servers. Her new goal is an algorithm that recognizes chips through retinal scanning. It's still testing on volunteers. Mia still wakes up at night with a buzzing in her ears. But now it's just tinnitus, the result of a neurotoxin overdose. Present. And in the darkness of the screens, in the corners of the dark net, a timer is ticking. The archive named Mirror is waiting in the wings. He bought the house for next to nothing. The realtor said something about minor cosmetic repairs and minor flaws, but Evan immediately realized that something was wrong. The dilapidated porch, the cracks in the foundation, the smell, a mixture of mold and something chemical, pungent, as if bleach mixed with rot. The neighbors did not greet each other. The woman across the street slammed the window shut every time he stepped out onto the lawn. The first night, he found a box in the basement. Not hidden, as if they were waiting for her. Inside, bundles of scribbled paper, photographs, VHS tapes. There are people in the pictures. Men, women, children. Everyone is in unnatural poses, with frozen faces, as if they were forced to freeze in front of the camera. On the back of one photo is the inscription, "They are watching. They're always watching." He put the tapes in an old Walkman lying in the garage. First entry, a room with concrete walls. A man in a clown mask methodically cuts meat on a cutting board. Suddenly he turns to the camera and whispers, "You're next." The second tape is the same room, but now there's a girl chained to a pipe. She's crying, begging for help. The camera is shaking, as if the cameraman is laughing. Evan wanted to call the police, but he noticed his house in the corner of the third tape. The same basement, the same stairs. There is a fresh paint inscription on the wall, "Don't leave." In the morning, he started digging under the floor. The shovel came across a plastic bag. Inside, there's hair, nails, and a decayed passport in the name of Lucas Gray. Date of birth, 15 years ago. The photo matched the teenager's face in one of the photos. Evan searched the web for mentions of Lucas. A post flashed on the missing persons forum. The guy disappeared after he posted an ad on the darknet exchange for the sale of exclusive content. At the bottom is a link to the blocked resource. Through Tor, Evan found an archive, hundreds of videos labeled Room 7, Project Omega, Last Guest. Evan turned off the laptop, but the whispers from the speaker did not stop. He pulled out the power cord, and the silence momentarily deafened him. The player's screen glowed in the darkness of the basement. On the tape, which he hadn't inserted, shots flashed, the same concrete room, but now there was a table with surgical instruments in it. There was a clock on the wall, the hands showed 3:07. Evan looked at his own, 3:07. He rushed into the garage, grabbed an axe and a flashlight. I should have gone to the police, but what would he show? Cassettes that may turn out to be editing? Photos that look like a production? He would have been mistaken for paranoid. Suddenly, his car's alarm went off. In the courtyard, in the rain, stood a figure in a black cloak. His face was hidden by a hood. Evan froze, but the man abruptly turned around and disappeared around the corner. There was a footprint on the wet asphalt, not a shoe, but as if something was dragging, leaving a furrow. When he returned to the house, he found a piece of paper on the kitchen table. It was written in red ink, "Room 7 is waiting. You're already too late." The handwriting matched the inscriptions on the photographs. Evan reached into the darknet archive. The video labeled Room 7 turned out to be streamed in real time. On the screen is his own bedroom. The camera was pointed at the bed where he slept last night. There was a silhouette with a knife in the corner. He searched the house in a panic. I found the camera in the ventilation, a tiny device with the Omega Corp logo. Google gave out only mentions of the bankruptcy of the company in 2012. They produced surveillance systems for prisons. Evan woke up at night to the sound of metal grinding. A leather-gloved hand came out from under the bed and grabbed his ankle. He struck with the axe, the blade sank into the floor, but there was no one there. Just the smell of chlorine and oil. The next morning, he dismantled the basement floor. There's a trapdoor under the boards. The rusty hinges howled as he lifted the lid. A staircase led down, but not into the ground, but into a concrete tunnel. The walls were covered with numbers and dates. Among them is today's number. The tunnel led to a door marked 7. Behind it is a laboratory, test tubes with cloudy liquid, magazines with graphs, cages with bones. There was a dictaphone on the table. Recording, male voice, hoarse from chemical burns. Object 12 has survived. Start the Omega phase. Use new gas. They should see them. Suddenly, Evan heard footsteps. He hid behind a closet as the door swung open. 2 men in gas masks entered. One was talking about a new sample, the other was laughing, pointing a knife at the wall. They say he's already inside the walls. Shall we play hide and seek? When they left, Evan found a key card with the Omega logo in his desk. He saw photos of his house in magazines. Caption: Testing area. Stage 6. Elimination of witnesses. At home, he discovered that the water in the sink had become viscous, with a pink tinge. A tooth fell out of the faucet. Human. An hour later, Evan received a call from an unknown person. A voice distorted by a disguiser: "You're breathing their air. They're already in your veins. Look at the hands." Black lines appeared on her wrists, as if ink was crawling under her skin. He opened the medical kit, but instead of bandages, there was a rat's head and a note inside: "Run." But where to? Evan got into the car, but the engine wouldn't start. There are cut wires and a doll in a bloody dress under the hood. A sign hung around the doll's neck: "Thank you for participating in the experiment." When he returned, he saw that all the windows of the house were boarded up from the inside. Evan pressed his back against the wall, trying to stifle his panic. The air hummed like high-voltage wires, and the black lines on his arms pulsed in time with his heart. He held the flashlight up to his wrist, and something thin, like parasites, was moving under his skin. "They're already in your veins." The voice on the phone wasn't lying. He broke the emergency fluorescent light in the kitchen. A greenish glow picked out bottles labeled VX9 from the darkness under the sink. Label: a 4th-generation hallucinogen. Properties: reality splitting, induced paranoia syndrome. On the bottom is the Omega logo. Evan remembered the viscous water, the tooth in the sink. They poisoned the water supply. The philosophy of fear here has been thought out to the smallest detail. Not monsters, not ghosts, reality itself became a weapon. Like a lab rat, he ran through a maze where the walls slowly narrowed. He found an old projector in the living room. The tape inside turned out to be a recording of an interview, a man in a suit, his face darkened. The Omega Project explores the limits of the human psyche. We create situations where the victim voluntarily becomes the executioner. Fear is the best catalyst. In the background, silhouettes in gas masks are leading someone into the camera. Evan opened the basement door with a knife. Downstairs, among the boxes of test tubes, he found a diary. The pages are dotted with crooked lines. Day 14. The VX-9 gas is driving me crazy. I see them in the corners, whispering. But Dr. Rains says it's part of the process. You have to learn to distinguish them from the real ones, he laughs. And how? They smell like burnt leather, just like him. Day 23. Today, they entered the room. Not shadows. Flesh and blood. Rains calls them images. They're what you believe in. I believe in demons, they come with horns. But his cellmate, the one who believed in maniacs, found him with his throat slit. His images were of knives. Evan began to shake. His black lines, the doll, the voice on the phone, all this worked on his fear. Omega didn't send assassins. They grew them out of his own nightmares. In the attic, he found a box of letters from the previous tenants. The last one, they said I was a volunteer. They're lying. I just bought a house. Dr. Rains, he's putting electrodes in my brain. He says I'm going to become a new species. Something like a prophet of fear. Suddenly, the walls creaked. The plaster crumbled, exposing steel plates with sensors. The house was not a training ground. Every room, every object is part of the system. Even the air is a tool. A whisper came from the speakers, "Look in the mirror, Evan. Look at who you've become." He couldn't resist. It wasn't him standing in the reflection, but a man in a clown mask with a knife. His face. His eyes were wide with horror. Omega's philosophy became clear: they didn't kill. They forced me to kill myself. Evan grabbed an axe and reached into the vent. The metal cut his knees, but he crawled until he hit the hatch. Behind it is a bunker with servers. There are hundreds of windows with people on the screens. Everyone is in their own house, everyone is in a hell of their own phobias. The chat was lit up with messages. User 457, help. My wife is one of them now. User 009, I burned out my eyes. They're still there. An inscription was lit on the main screen: the experiment is completed. Activation of the final stage. Evan heard a scrape behind him. I turned around and he was standing there. The axe in the doppelganger's hand flashed. Evan pressed himself against the cold wall of the server room, watching his doppelganger approach with an axe. The clown's face twisted into a grimace, just like his own, as he squinted in fear. It wasn't a hallucination, he realized. The mask was made of silicone, the seams were visible at the neck. There's a man underneath it. Did you think we were going to let you ruin everything? The voice behind the mask sounded mechanical, as if through a synthesizer. You are stage 7. The crown of creation. The axe whistled through the air. Evan jumped back, hitting the server rack. The faces of other victims flashed on the screens, a woman smashing mirrors with her fists, an old man digging a hole in the middle of the living room. The chat exploded with a new message: they're in the walls. Who are you? Evan shouted, dodging another blow. We are the correctors, the mask spoke while the doppelganger was methodically chopping down the equipment. Sparks rained down on the floor. Fear is a cancer. We're his. We burn it out. Suddenly, the doppelganger froze. A man in a protective suit without a mask came out from behind the servers. Gray stubble, a scar across his left eye. Dr. Rains. It's wonderful, isn't it? He pointed at the screens. Each of them voluntarily entered this reality. Just like you. Buying a house, signing a contract. You agreed to the experiment. Evan remembered the mountains of paperwork at the time of purchase. Paragraph 14.b, the owner grants the right to use the premises for research purposes. He wasn't even reading. Why? Evan gasped. To create immunity, Rains took out a syringe with a black liquid. The world is collapsing. Terrorism, pandemics, artificial intelligence. People are weak. But imagine a race that isn't afraid. To do this, you have to go through hell. And survive. You're burning their brains out. No. We're theirs, reloading it. The doctor smiled. VX9 blurs the line between fear and rage. You saw for yourself, your hallucinations have materialized. Thanks to the nanoparticles in the water. They communicate with neurons, projecting nightmares outside. Your doppelganger is just your own fear, made flesh through chemistry. Evan looked at the black lines under his skin. Nanorobots. The ones that were mentioned in Omega magazines. You're selling this as a weapon, he whispered. Weapons? No. This is salvation. Imagine soldiers who don't feel pain. Policemen who know no doubts. But first, he nodded to the doppelganger, it is necessary to destroy the weak. The doppelganger stepped forward, but Evan yanked the cable out of the socket, hitting the clown under the knee. He collapsed, the mask slipped to one side. Underneath it is the face of a scarred teenager. Lucas Gray. The guy in the photo from the package. He died last year, Rains said as Lucas gasped for air. But his fear, his anger is so beautiful that we have kept a sample. Like thousands of others. Evan grabbed the server disk. I will destroy all your data. It's getting late, the doctor took out the remote control. The system is autonomous. Even if I die, Omega will grow. Like a virus. In every home, in every country. It's fear. He's contagious. The wall behind Evan suddenly disintegrated into pixels. A hologram. Behind it is a real laboratory, operating tables with people strapped in, screens with brain activity indicators, tanks with liquid nitrogen, where tissue samples floated. On the wall is the slogan, "Fear is fuel." Burn it. You've become the perfect model, Rains approached. You survived where others broke down. Now we'll take your fear, and clone it. By creating an army. Evan looked at the syringe in the doctor's hands. The black liquid was bubbling. A cocktail of fear and rage. No, he whispered. You made a mistake. He threw the disc at Rains, hitting him in the temple. The doctor collapsed, the syringe shattered. A black substance got on Lucas' skin. The teenager screamed, his muscles began to throb unnaturally. What have you done? Rains shouted, trying to stand up. Evan was already running down the hallway. Behind him, Lucas could be heard snarling at the doctor. Screams mixed with the sounds of tearing flesh. Evan found a canister of gasoline in the garage. He doused the walls, servers, test tubes. The match fell on a puddle of VX9. The flames consumed the house in seconds. Evan stood on the road, watching the fire consume the archive of his nightmares. Sirens wailed in the distance. Not the police, but unmarked black vans. He ran into the woods. The black lines on his wrists gradually disappeared. Nanorobots died without refueling. But he found a note in his pocket that he didn't remember, you carry Omega in your blood. We'll find you. Or you'll find us. Since then, Evan has been changing cities, names, and faces. But he dreams every night. The same house. The same door with the number 7. And Rain's voice, whispering, "You're our best export product now." A month after his escape, Evan found a forum. The link was sent to an anonymous email with the subject, "You've become famous." The site resembled a mix of Reddit and darknet exchanges. There was a fixed post in the Omega Project results section. The author, verified researcher. Stage 7 is completed. The EV object showed amazing resistance. His fear evolved into aggression, which confirms the hypothesis of suppressing the instinct of self-preservation. I'm attaching samples for sponsors. Below is the video. Evan is in the house, chopping down the door with an axe, shouting at the empty walls, and a shadow with a knife flashes in the corner of the frame. In the comments. Sponsor, this is enough for the military test stage. Tell Rains that the contract has been signed. Neurolab, materials on nanorobots require further development. The EV sample must be delivered to point 12. Evan scrolled through other topics. In the live experiments section, users posted home videos with the hashtags #OmegaTeist and #fear inside. Video 1, a girl in a mask knocks on a locked door with her fists. Day 3. They injected something into my coffee. They say my husband is one of them now. But I haven't seen him for a week. Video 2, a man with a camera on his forehead runs through the forest. They're in the trees. You see? Their eyes are glowing. Off, camera laughter, clearly edited. The most popular post is, "How to become a part of Omega?" Author, Dr. R. We are looking for those who are ready to overcome themselves. Buy any house from our list, 27 addresses are attached, sign the contract, and become the creator of a new era. Your fear will become the currency. Your pain is art. At the bottom is a link to the auction, photos of the subjects with a description of their phobias and current status. Lot 78, Mark T. Fear, Suffocation. Status, Stage 4. Started self-tightening loops. Lot 112, Lisa R. Fear, Insects. Status, Stage 6. Cybernetic cockroaches have been implanted in a hearing aid. Evan was searched for under lot number 0014, Evan K. Fear, Loss of Control. Status, Escape. Special marks, Omega Bearer. Reward for capture, $500,000. He hacked the account using the old password from the mail he used in the house. In private messages, Rain's correspondence with clients. Rains will provide custom nightmares. Do you want your enemy to be afraid of water? We'll embed a drowning scene in his brain via a Wi-Fi router. Client X, I need my competitor to commit suicide. Make sure that he sees his children dead. Rains, no problem. But for personalization, you need DNA, hair, nails. And prepayment in bitcoins. In the export folder, Evan found a video of his torture module. Footage of his escape was mounted in a trailer with the hashtag Omega update. In the video, his face was superimposed on soldiers shooting into the crowd, with the text, "The new generation is not afraid. It destroys." The comments are enthusiastic. Investor_Prime, where can I buy shares? Soldier Mood, give 100 doses to my squad. Evan recorded a video message. In front of a muffler, wearing a hood. If you see this, they already know about you. Check the lease and purchase agreements, item 14.b. Do not drink tap water. Don't trust your neighbors. Your fear. The video was deleted after 3 minutes. But screenshots surfaced on Twitter with the caption, "Psychos are trending." The hashtag #OmegaZagover has gained 1 million views. People started checking their homes, finding chambers in the ventilation, traces of drugs in the water. There is a new post on the Omega forum. Author, Dr. R. Thank you for the free advertisement. Due to the increased demand, we are recruiting volunteers. The first 100 participants will receive a discount on the exclusive Family Nightmare package. Evan realized that his story had been turned into a meme. Fear has become a pastime. Evan was sitting in the basement of an abandoned loft, rented for the last bitcoins. A chat with Alice, the girl he met before buying the house, was flashing on the laptop screen. Her message glowed like a reproach. Evan, are you even alive? You're writing some nonsense. He stared at his hands. Black lines now covered the body up to the neck, like cracks. The nanorobots devoured him from the inside out, turning him into a walking experiment. A pop-up window on the screen interrupted my thoughts. The hacking of Omega servers has been completed. The mailing list has started. He pressed enter. Thousands of letters flew to the relatives of the missing. Your son, Mark T., has not lost his mind. He was tortured in the Omega project. Here's the evidence, videos, contracts, laboratory coordinates. Your daughter Lisa R. is alive. They implanted a chip in her brain. Find the file, cyberterracony.pdf. The answers came instantly. Mark's mother, who are you? Is this a prank? Lisa's father, I'll call the police. But Evan knew, the police had been bought long ago. Instead, he opened a conversation with Alice. Evan, I'm sorry I lied to you about fishing and hiking. It was all a lie. I won't be able to pretend to be normal anymore. Alice, are you drunk? Evan, you'll see it on the news soon. And please, don't drink tap water. He leaned back in his chair. My chest ached like glass was crumbling in my lungs. Nanorobots have reached the heart. A thread was already burning on the Omega forum, data leak. Code 0xFear has been activated. Dr. Rains, alive, or his digital clone, wrote. We thank Anonymous for the free PR. We remind you that everyone who opened our files received a dose of VX9 through the screen. Check your eyes, are they turning red already? The comments turned into hysteria. User 88, I'm blind. God, what are those worms in your eyes? Mother of 2, my children are screaming that the walls are moving. You are monsters. Evan updated the news page. Top of the list, mass psychogenic epidemic, people hospitalized with symptoms of delirium. He clicked on Alice's stream. She was looking at the camera, holding a glass of water. Evan, if you can see that. You're a fucker. I'll post your correspondence everywhere. Don't drink the water. Yes, She took a sip. The camera recorded her pupils dilating dramatically. What? What's wrong with me? She touched her face. Evan? What did you do? The screen went blank. He wanted to write, but his fingers wouldn't work anymore. The black lines reached the brain. Evan's last post, automatically sent after death. If you're reading this, I've become part of the system. They won. But look at your contracts. On the water. On the walls. Fear is not your emotion. This is their fuel. Break it. The text stopped. An hour later, the hashtag #OmegaWest became the trend. People burned down houses, hacked into water utilities, but this only wreaked havoc. Amid the riots, Omega launched an advertisement. Tired of being afraid? Buy an antidote for 0.5 BTC. The guarantee of peace is 24 hours. Alice was found in the bathroom. The autopsy revealed a heart attack. But those who saw her post-mortem photos noticed that the black lines on her arms exactly mirrored Evan's pattern. And the auction continued to work on the dark web. A new one appeared among the lots. Number 0014A, Alice L. Fear, Betrayal. Status, completed. Special marks, communication with the carrier. Starting price, 200,000 BTC. They appeared in local news bulletins every few years, short notes about missing persons. Tourists, thrill seekers, tramps. They all had one thing in common: they were last seen near an old cemetery on the outskirts of a remote forest. Locals whispered that the land there was unclean, but the real nightmare had nothing to do with ghosts. The cemetery appeared at the end of the 19th century as a temporary shelter for victims of an epidemic that wiped out workers from a nearby factory. The graves were dug hastily, without names, crosses or fences. When the disease receded, the site was abandoned, and after a couple of decades it was completely forgotten. By the 1950s, the area was overgrown with thorny bushes, and the ground had sunk, exposing rotting coffins. The local authorities put up a rusty fence with a sign saying, "Private property," but that didn't stop vandals, drug addicts, and curious teenagers. In 1987, a forester checking wild boar traps came across the body of a man. The corpse was lying in a pit, covered with lime, with a slit throat. The investigation stalled because the victim had no identification, and there were no cameras in the area. A year later, a couple of students who were collecting material for a course on abandoned cemeteries disappeared in the same way. Their backpacks were found at the entrance, and inside there was a dictaphone with 3 minutes of recording, screams, muffled thuds, and someone's heavy breathing. The police attributed the cases to unidentified criminals, but residents of the nearest village swore that they heard footsteps at night, as if someone was dragging heavy bags on the ground. Laura didn't believe in urban legends. At 24, she was into trash tourism, sneaking into abandoned factories, climbing into drainage tunnels, and then posting videos on YouTube. The cemetery seemed to be an ideal location: gloomy, atmospheric, safe. She took with her a cameraman friend, Mark, and a drone for panoramic filming. For the first 2 hours, nothing foreshadowed trouble. They took down dilapidated crypts, sunken graves, and a flock of crows circling the trees. While Mark was changing the battery in the camera, Laura decided to explore the far corner of the cemetery. There, behind a pile of rocks, she noticed a trapdoor, iron, covered with a layer of dirt, but clearly modern. The handle was welded, but the rust made the metal brittle. Hitting the crowbar, she opened the passage. A staircase led down, smelling of damp and chemicals. The flashlight picked out concrete walls, overhead wires, and plastic cans. There were empty syringes, pieces of duct tape, and gloves with brown stains on the floor. Laura was about to call the police when she noticed a door with a combination lock. There was a groan behind her. Mark, who came down after her, tried to persuade her to leave, but Laura turned on the live broadcast. "Guys, this is not a joke, there's someone here," she whispered into the camera. Viewers will later tell how a shadow flashed behind her back, and the sound abruptly stopped. The police examined the recording and found an underground laboratory. The walls of the room were covered with polyethylene, on the tables were equipment for the production of methamphetamine, and in the corner, cells. 3 cages, as if for large dogs, with chains and bowls for water. In one of them lay the corpse of a man in torn clothes, his face disfigured by chemical burns. The examination showed that he died the day before the arrival of the group. But the scariest thing was found in the next room. There was a calendar on the wall with dates matching the disappearances over the past 5 years. Next to it is a notebook with notes. Number 12, too weak, could not withstand the dose. Number 15, tried to escape, disposed of in the mine. The last entry read, Number 23 is a female blogger. Surveillance is possible. Prepare for relocation. Laura and Mark were never found. A month later, Their drone was found in the forest. There were 3 seconds of shaky recordings on the memory card, Laura, pinned to the ground by someone's hand in a black glove, and a voiceover, "You ruined my perfect place." The woods around the cemetery were cordoned off for 3 weeks. The police searched every meter of the underground laboratory, seizing kilograms of drugs, homemade weapons, and folders with photographs. Hundreds of pictures, men, women, teenagers, all with numbers on their chests, like cattle for slaughter. Some were identified from missing persons databases. Others have remained nameless statistics. Investigators assumed that the criminals had been using the cemetery as a shelter for years. They buried industrial waste in old graves, and turned tourists into experimental subjects for testing new methamphetamine formulas. The survivors were sold into slavery or forced to work in a laboratory. But the leader remained in the shadows. The only clue is the voice from the drone recording. The linguists noted a slight accent, possibly Eastern European, and a strange slip of the tongue, "the perfect place." It became clear that this was not just a drug lab. In the notebooks, they found diagrams of tunnels going deep into the forest. The engineers determined that part of the tunnels led to abandoned mines where shale was mined in the middle of the 20th century. The criminals turned them into a system of traps, pits with stakes, weights suspended over precipices, carbon monoxide chambers. That explained why no one had escaped. Meanwhile, a quiet panic began in the town. A local pharmacist, Jacob Rayner, disappeared 2 days after the lab was discovered. A note was found in his house, "They know what I saw." It turned out that Jacob had been supplying painkillers to pharmacies for years, and shipping some of the prescriptions to the cemetery. His computer was hacked, and his last search query was, "How to delete GPS history." The surviving victims, those who had been found, refused to speak. One guy, with his face disfigured by acid, was in a mental hospital for a week, muttering, "He comes in his sleep, says I'm part of the system now." The nurses thought it was nonsense until a plumber came into the room with a bag of tools. After his visit, the patient fell silent forever. The doctors diagnosed a stroke, but the camera in the hallway recorded a stab in the neck. Laura woke up in total darkness, with a rag bag over her head. His arms are twisted behind his back, and his mouth tastes of blood and gasoline. Mark was wheezing nearby. They pulled out 2 of my teeth. They say it's for your stream. They were kept in a hole dug under the garage. Every few hours, a bucket of water and dog food were lowered from above. The guard, a boy of about 18 with a tattoo of number 8 on his wrist, once blabbed, "The boss likes those who resist. You are now models for new experiments." They were moved a week later. Laura remembered the sound of the truck engine, the cries of seagulls and the smell of fish. Then there was a cold wind, the creak of metal and footsteps on gravel. When the bag was removed, she saw an abandoned drilling rig in the sea, covered with seagulls. Downstairs, people in handcuffs lived in rusty containers. Some were cleaning fish, others were assembling some kind of devices. "Welcome to the factory," the man with the burned hands whispered. "They make bombs here. And those who don't work well are sent to the bottom." She didn't know which was worse, the daily humiliation, the endurance tests with new drugs, or the fact that at night someone inserted a flash drive with her old videos into her camera. In one of them, recorded a year before, she laughed, standing on the edge of the drainage tunnel, "I feel immortal." The drilling rig looked like a giant rusty spider, digging its paws into the seabed. Waves crashed against the metal supports, salt water corroded the wounds on Laura's wrists. She was forced to work in a narrow hold that smelled of fuel oil and decomposing fish. Together with a dozen other prisoners, she collected improvised explosives, TNT sticks wrapped with nails and wires. "For terrorist attacks," explained a thin man with scars instead of ears. "Or for blackmail. The boss likes options." Mark was transferred to another part of the tower. Laura saw him only once a day, when the guards dropped them off in a shared cell for a smoke break. His face was gray, and his eyes were shifty, like those of a hunted animal. "They're injecting me with something. It's new every day," he whispered, while the guards smoked at the hatch. "They say if I survive, I'll become an improved version." Attempts at rebellion were quickly suppressed. When a guy from Brazil hit a guard with a wrench, he was tied to a winch and slowly lowered into the water. The cameras captured crabs plastering his face, and seagulls pecking out his eyes. The video was shown to everyone at dinner. "Study," the guard said, clicking the remote control from the projector. "Or you'll become fodder." Laura noticed that some of the prisoners were resigned. A woman in her 40s, a former teacher, was now soldering detonators perfectly. "I do them with marriage," she confessed one day. "I hope they explode in the hands of these bastards." But more often people broke down. The teenager, whose name was number 31, cut his forearms with a nail every night until he was discovered and chained to a pipe for starvation rations. Salvation came from a place that was not expected. Guard number 8, the boy with the tattoo, started tossing pieces of cards to Laura. Patrol routes, shift schedules, and camera blind spots were drawn on scraps of paper. "They killed my sister," he wrote on the back of the cafeteria menu. "Help me, and I'll blow this shit up." The plan took a week to mature. Number 8 had to turn off the generator during the night shift. Laura and Mark, along with 3 other prisoners, would have made their way to the lifeboats. The teacher volunteered to mine the diesel warehouse, to burn like hell. But an hour before the escape, Mark was gone. He was found in the toilet with empty syringes in his hands. His eyes were open, and blood was foaming from his mouth. "Overdose," the guard announced, dragging the body across the floor. "Who's next?" Laura almost lost her temper, but number 8 grabbed her hand. "If we don't leave now, we'll all die." The generator shut down at 2:14. The guards rushed to the control panel, not noticing how the prisoners slipped out through the ventilation hatch. They ran along the narrow catwalks, clinging to the handrails, tearing their skin off against the rust. Shots rang out from behind as the teacher activated the bomb. A fireball engulfed the central platform, illuminating the night sea. There was no boat. Number 8, bleeding from a bullet wound in his side, pointed to a dark dot in the distance. "There's a fishing boat. They come for cargo once a month. We'll get there by swimming." Laura jumped into the icy water last. The current dragged him down, and his wounds burned with salt. She swam, following the cries of seagulls, until her hands came across a net. The fisherman pulled her out, cursing in an incomprehensible language. When she whispered, "Police," the oldest pulled out a knife, but then number 8 emerged from the water. His face was blue, and his fingers were clutching a grenade without a pin. "Take us, or I'll blow up your hold," he wheezed. The ship turned towards the shore. Laura, wrapped in a dirty blanket, watched the drilling rig turn into a sparkling dot on the horizon. Number 8 died in her arms 2 hours later. In the pocket of his jacket, she found a photo of him and a teenage girl who looked like him standing at the entrance to the zoo. On the back is an inscription, "Come back alive, idiot." The fishermen landed them at the port, which was even marked on maps as a private territory. The docks were deserted except for cranes with peeling paint and a barge piled high with rusty barrels. The older one, with a face scarred by nets, demanded that Laura give everything she had. She held out a picture of number 8 and his sister. The man froze, looked at the boy's corpse lying in a pool of fuel oil, and spat, "Get out. And if you get caught, you didn't know me." They walked along the shore all night. Laura stumbled over the rocks, her torn jacket chafing her neck. Explosions were still ringing in my ears, and fiery glare was dancing in front of my eyes. By morning, they reached the abandoned lighthouse. The interior smelled of mold and gasoline. There were empty cans of stew on the floor, spent shell casings, and tubes of medicines that had expired 10 years ago. They found a walkie-talkie in the corner, ancient but working. His first attempt to contact the police was almost his last. The voice on the speaker, introducing himself as a sergeant, asked for their coordinates. Laura had already opened her mouth when the teacher pulled out the microphone. He lied. Real cops would have asked for the password. It turned out that a year earlier, one of the prisoners from the tower had tried to call for help. He was found hanged with the same radio around his neck. The plan was born out of desperation. The teacher, whose name was Elaine, remembered about the flash drive with the video that was thrown into Laura's camera. "They're monitoring your channel," she said. "So they can follow your social media." Laura took out a wet phone from her pocket, which had miraculously survived in a plastic bag. The battery was at 3%, but she managed to log into the cloud. There, among the old videos, there was a video from the cemetery, the underground laboratory, the calendar with dates, the notebook. She posted it to a private account that only her younger brother had access to, with the caption, "If I'm gone, give it to the FBI." An hour later, the phone picked up a weak signal. A text message came, "Little sister, are you alive?" Laura managed to write, "Yes," before the screen went blank. The shelter was opened at dawn. The first alarm was given by the cry of seagulls. They darted over the lighthouse, as if sensing danger. Elaine looked out the window. 3 men in black were walking along the beach, with dogs on leashes. "They're on the trail," she whispered. "We need to get to the highway." We ran through the pine forest, branches slapping our faces. Laura was carrying a wounded Elaine on her back, who had stepped on a trap, a bear trap covered with leaves. The bones hadn't broken, but the rusty teeth had punctured the muscles. "Leave me alone," the woman wheezed. "Get to the trucks on Highway 95. Drivers sometimes give me a ride." Laura was silent. She had already lost Mark and number 8, she couldn't leave another one. They climbed out onto the asphalt and crawled to the curb. The first truck stopped. The driver, a bearded man in a cowboy hat, leaned out the window. Laura wanted to shout, "Yes," but Elaine grabbed her arm. "You can't," she whispered. "Look at his boots." The leather boots were as clean as new, even though the road was covered in mud. This is not the case with truckers. They refused. The driver left, but returned 5 minutes later with reinforcements. 2 SUVs cut off their path to the forest. Masked men got out of the cars. One of them was holding a tranquilizer gun for large animals. Laura turned to run and saw a school bus on the road. Yellow, with cracked windows, but moving at full speed. She jumped out into the middle of the highway, waving her arms. The brakes howled, and the bus spun across the road. Teenagers in tracksuits poured out of the door, the basketball team, judging by the inscriptions on the backpacks. "Hey, what's going on here?" The coach, a man under 2 meters tall, shouted. The masked men hesitated. Laura did not remember how she got on the bus, how the coach gave her a bottle of water and called an ambulance on the radio. Elaine was losing consciousness, but managed to whisper, "Don't tell them the truth. Tell them that we ran away from our rapist husband." The ambulance arrived 40 minutes later. The orderlies, bored guys in their 20s, didn't even ask for names. "Just another homeless man with an overdose," one of them snorted, hoisting Elaine onto a stretcher. Laura pretended to be asleep. She heard the dispatcher's radio saying, "A girl with red hair, about 25. Take him to the hospital on Vine Street." She jumped up as the bus turned onto the exit ramp to the city. She knocked out the window with her fists and jumped into the bushes. The last thing she saw was Elaine looking at her from the stretcher. The woman raised her hand, showing 3 fingers, "Wait 3 days." Laura lay in the manhole for 2 days, clutching the phone stolen from the bus to her chest. On the 3rd morning, exactly 72 hours after jumping from the ambulance, she ventured out. The city park was empty, except for a stray dog rummaging through the trash. She turned on her phone, and her brother's new Twitter account glowed with a notification: "The authorities have the video. Wait for help." But help came from the wrong side. The first to appear were teenagers on bicycles, ordinary boys in caps, until one of them pulled out a pistol with a silencer. Laura started to run, but her leg was cramped. A bullet pierced her shoulder as she stumbled over tree roots. The second shot hit him in the stomach. She fell face first into the mud, feeling the warmth spreading under her jacket. "Don't kill me right away," said the voice above her. "The boss wants to talk." She was loaded into a van marked "Pizza Delivery." It smelled of bleach and blood inside. Across from him sat a man in a suit, with his face covered by an anonymous mask from internet memes. The voice was soft, almost paternal. "You ruined my rig, Laura. Burned tons of equipment. She killed my people. But I admire your audacity. Therefore, I will give you a choice." He handed her 2 syringes. "Red is adrenaline with a neurotoxin. You'll die in a minute, but you'll feel every cell. Blue is an experimental stimulant. If you survive, you'll be a better person. Like Mark." Laura spat into his mask. "I choose the third option." The man laughed. "Your brother is already on the bus. With 4 kilograms of explosives in his backpack. If you don't call him in an hour, he'll die a hero." The phone in Laura's pocket vibrated. On the screen is my brother's face pressed against the window of a moving bus. Behind him are children in school uniforms. "Well, blogger," said the masked man, "do you still want to be a hero?"